I'm Anabelle Dean, 32, a quiet librarian who's always been a family disappointment. While my siblings flaunted their suburban mansions and luxury cars, I lived in what they called a shoebox, a cramped 400 square foot apartment with peeling wallpaper and a temperamental radiator. At our father's birthday dinner, their laughter cut deep as they mocked my pathetic little hovel in front of everyone. Honestly, Annabelle, my sister Claire sneered, when are you going to grow up and get a real place? What they didn't know what none of them suspected was that my tiny apartment sat on land worth $8 million. The inheritance letter tucked in my grandmother's jewelry box would change everything. Their mockery was about to become the most expensive mistake of their lives. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, stay with me. This story is for you. The silence in my car felt heavier than the humid August evening as I drove home from Dad's 70th birthday dinner. My hands still trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from the wine had barely touched my glass, but from the humiliation that had unfolded like a slow-motion accident at Romano's Italian restaurant. It had started innocently enough. Dad, resplendent in his new navy blazer, had been holding court at the head of our usual corner table, regaling us with stories from his recent golf trip to Scottsdale. Mom sat beside him, radiant in her pearl necklace, occasionally touching his arm with the practiced affection of 43 years of marriage. Claire had arrived fashionably late, as always, her designer heels clicking against the restaurant's marble floor like a metronome announcing her importance. At 35, my older sister had perfected the art of making an entrance. Her honey blonde hair caught the ambient lighting just so, and her black cocktail dress probably cost more than I made in a month at the library. Sorry, she breezed, air-kissing everyone before settling into her chair with a flourish. Traffic was absolutely insane coming from the suburbs. You know how it is. Marcus, my younger brother at 29, had chuckled knowingly. He'd been there for 20 minutes already, his wife Sarah beside him, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a luxury car commercial. Marcus had inherited Dad's broad shoulders and easy smile, while Sarah brought old money elegance to every family gathering with her. Understudded jewelry and perfectly pressed clothing. Tell me about it, Marcus had agreed. We're thinking of getting a second car just for city trips. The Range Rover is such a hassle to park downtown. And there I sat in my 3-year-old cardigan and sensible flats, feeling like a sparrow among peacocks. My modest teacher's salary had stretched to cover a nice bottle of wine for Dad, and a new bookmark from the museum, gift shop handcrafted silver with his initials engraved. It seemed pathetic next to Claire's expensive watch, and Marcus's weekend getaway gift certificate. The conversation had flowed around me like water around a stone. Claire's latest promotion at the marketing firm, Marcus's expanding consulting, business, Sarah's charity work, and their upcoming kitchen renovation. Mom and Dad beamed with pride, asking detailed questions about square footage and marble countertops and investment portfolios. When Dad had finally turned to me with expectant eyes, I'd felt my stomach clench. And how are things with you, sweetheart? Still enjoying the library work? The way he said it with that gentle, slightly patronizing tone reserved for discussing a child's hobby made my cheeks burn. Yes, Dad. We just finished our summer reading program. The kids were amazing. That's nice, honey, Mom had said, but I could see her attention already drifting toward Claire's animated description of her new BMW. It was Marcus who delivered the killing blow. Though I don't think he meant it cruelly. He was cutting into his steak when he casually mentioned their house hunting adventures. We're looking at this incredible place in Westchester, he'd said between bites. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, wraparound porch. The realtor says, it's perfect for growing families. Sarah had glowed at the implication, her hand unconsciously drifting to her still flat stomach. They'd been married 2 years and the family was starting to hint about grandchildren. How wonderful, Mom had exclaimed. What's the square footage? 3,200 square feet, Sarah had replied proudly. Plus a finished basement and a 3-car garage. Claire had laughed, a tinkling sound like expensive crystal. God, that's 8 times bigger than Annabelle's shoebox. The table had gone quiet for just a moment, the kind of silence that falls when someone says something that hovers just on the edge of acceptable. Dad had cleared his throat uncomfortably. Now Claire, but she was already in motion, emboldened by the wine and the appreciative chuckles from Marcus and Sarah. I'm serious. Annie, when are you going to grow up and get a real place? You're 32 years old, living in what, 400 square feet? It's honestly kind of pathetic. Claire, Mom had said, but there was no real censure in her voice. If anything, she looked curious, as if she too had been wondering the same thing. I mean, I know librarians don't make much, Claire had continued, warming to her theme, but surely you could afford something better than that hovel. What do you even do in there? Where do you put anything? Marcus had joined in, not maliciously, but with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never questioned his own privilege. Seriously, sis, Sarah and I would go crazy in a space that small. How do you even have people over? I don't really, I'd started to say, but Claire cut me off. Exactly. You can't have a normal adult life in a place like that. No wonder you're still single. The birthday cake had arrived then, blazing with 70 candles, and everyone had burst into song. But I sat there, my face burning with shame, feeling smaller and smaller as my family's laughter echoed around me. I had made my excuses before the coffee course, claiming an early morning at work. Dad had hugged me goodbye, pressing a $20 bill into my hand for gas money, which somehow made everything worse out now. Pulling into the narrow alley behind my building, I sat in my car for a long moment, staring up at the single light glowing in my fourth-floor window. My pathetic little hovel, my shoebox, the place where I couldn't have a normal adult life. Tomorrow I decided I would start looking for somewhere bigger. Somewhere that wouldn't embarrass my family. Somewhere that might finally make them proud of me. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs slowly, my legs heavy with exhaustion and defeat. The key turned in my lock with its familiar stubborn resistance, and I stepped into my tiny apartment, closing the door behind me and leaning against it, as if to keep the world's judgment at bay in the quiet darkness. Surrounded by my books and my grandmother's teacup and the life I'd built in these 400 square feet, I finally let myself cry. Sleep eluded me that night, so I found myself curled on my narrow couch at 3 a.m, wrapped in Grandmother Rose's crocheted afghan, flipping through the photo album I kept on the bottom shelf of my bookcase. The pages whispered as I turned them, each photograph a window into a past that suddenly felt more relevant than ever. There we were at Claire's 8th birthday party, me, 5 years old, standing slightly apart from the group of children clustered around the princess-themed cake. Even then, you could see it in the composition of the photograph. Claire at the center, radiant in her pink party dress, while I hovered at the edge in a hand-me-down outfit that was too big for my small frame. I traced my finger over my younger self's face, remembering how left out I'd felt that day. Mom had been so focused on making everything perfect for Claire, the decorations, the games, the guest list of popular kids from her class. When one of the children had asked if I was Claire's sister, Mom had laughed and said, "Oh, that's just Anabelle. She's the quiet one. Just Anabelle." Even at 5, I'd understood that this was not a compliment. The pattern was there in every family photograph, subtle but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Claire in the center, then Marcus when he came along 3 years later, and me perpetually off to one side or in the back row. The Christmas morning when Claire got the bicycle she'd been begging for while I received a stack of books' practical gifts. Mom had called them. Though I'd wanted the art supplies, I'd circled hopefully in the toy catalog. There was Marcus at 7, grinning gap-toothed in his Little League uniform while Dad knelt beside him, pride radiating from every line of his posture. I played softball too for 2 seasons, but there were no photographs of me in uniform. I'd been good at it better than Marcus, actually, but my games always seemed to conflict with Claire's piano recitals or Marcus's more important tournaments. It's hard to be everywhere at once, Mom would say apologetically, and I'd learned to nod and understand, even when understanding felt like swallowing glass. But then I turned the page and found her Grandmother Rose, captured in a candid moment during one of our Sunday visits. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral upholstery, and I was on the floor beside her, my head resting against her knee while she read aloud from the the secret garden? The photographer probably Dad had caught. Her mid-sentence, her reading glasses perched on her nose, one hand resting gently on my hair. Rose Dean had been the exception to every rule in our family. While everyone else seemed to speak in coded language about my shortcomings, my quietness, my impracticality, my lack of ambition, Grandmother Rose spoke to me like I was fascinating. "You have depths, Anabelle," she would tell me during our walks through Riverside Park. "The others, they're all surface shine like coins fresh from the mint. But you're like an old river still and deep, with treasures hidden beneath." I'd been 13 when she said that, struggling with the particular agony of middle school social dynamics and the growing awareness that I didn't fit the mold my family seemed to expect. Claire was student council president, already showing signs of the confident charisma that would serve her well in marketing. Marcus was the class clown, beloved by teachers and students alike for his easy humor and natural athleticism. And I was the bookworm, the one who spent lunch periods in the library, the one who preferred reading to socializing, the one who observed more than she participated. There's nothing wrong with being different. Grandmother Rose had told me that day, her voice carrying the authority of her 78 years. The world needs observers, Anabelle. It needs people who see what others miss. She'd been the only one who attended my high school poetry reading, sitting in the front row of the nearly empty auditorium while I recited verses about loneliness and belonging. Afterward, she'd taken me for ice cream and told me that my words had made her cry, but in a good way. She'd assured me quickly, seeing my stricken expression. "You have a gift for seeing people's hearts," she'd said, licking her strawberry cone, with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who'd stopped caring what others thought decades ago. "Don't let anyone convince you that's not valuable." The photographs told the story of our relationship, two countless images of just the two of us. Grandmother Rose teaching me to knit on her sun-drenched porch. The two of us feeding ducks at the pond in Central Park. Her showing me how to press flowers between the pages of heavy books, creating the herbarium that I still kept on my windowsill. "We're kindred spirits, you and I," she told me once when I was 16 and crying over some perceived slight from my parents. They'd missed my academic awards ceremony to attend one of Marcus's basketball games, and I felt that familiar sting of being considered less important. "They don't mean to hurt you," she'd said gently, but there was steel in her voice. "They just don't understand that there are different kinds of value in this world. They see the obvious things, the shiny achievements, the loud successes. But they miss the quiet victories, the deep thoughts, the gentle heart that notices when others are hurting." She'd been talking about my volunteer work at the animal shelter, something I'd never mentioned to my parents because it seemed too small compared to Claire's internships and Marcus's scholarship offers. "How did you know about that?" I asked, startled. "I know lots of things about you, sweet girl. I know you save your allowance to buy books for the children's ward at the hospital. I know you write in that journal every night, working through your thoughts and feelings like a real philosopher. I know you see beauty in small things, in the way light falls through leaves, in the pattern frost makes on windows, in the stories hidden in strangers' faces." Looking at her photograph now, I could almost hear her voice again, warm and steady and utterly convinced of my worth. She died when I was 26, just 2 years after I'd started working at the library. The funeral had been well attended. She'd been beloved in our neighborhood, known for her kindness and her apple pies and her habit of checking on elderly neighbors. But I'd been the one she'd chosen to help sort through her belongings afterward. "Anabelle has the most patience," she'd written in her will, "and the most respect for memories." It had taken me weeks to go through her small apartment, carefully cataloging and distributing her possessions according to her detailed instructions. Most of it had gone to charity or to other family members, but she'd left me specific items: her collection of vintage books, her jewelry box with its intricate inlaid design, and the set of bone china teacups that had belonged to her own grandmother. "These are for someone who understands the value of beautiful things," her note had said. "Someone who will use them, not just display them." I still drank my morning tea from one of those cups, carefully washing it by hand each day, treasuring the connection to the woman who'd believed in me when no one else seemed to, the apartment I lived in now, my pathetic shoebox, According to Claire, I'd found it the month after Grandmother Rose's funeral. I'd been living in a shared house in Queens with 3 roommates who treated common spaces like personal storage units and whose idea of quiet, ours, didn't align with my need for peace. This place had called to me the moment I'd seen the listing, not because it was large or luxurious, but because of the light that streamed through the eastern windows and the built-in bookshelves that lined one entire wall. The neighborhood was still transitioning then, caught between its industrial past, an uncertain future which made the rent affordable on my librarian's salary. But more than that, it was only 6 blocks from where Grandmother Rose had lived. I could walk the same streets we'd explored together, shop at the same corner market where she'd bought her weekly groceries, sit on the same park bench where she'd shared her observations about life and human nature. Living here felt like keeping a connection to the one person who truly understood me. Every morning when I made my tea in her cup and watched the sun slant through my windows, I felt her presence not ghostly or supernatural, but solid and comforting. Like a warm hand on my shoulder. My family had never understood the choice. You could get so much more space in New Jersey, Mom had suggested. Or even Queens. Why pay Manhattan rent for a place the size of a closet? They never asked what the neighborhood meant to me, never thought to consider that proximity to memories might be worth more than square footage. They saw only the practical aspects, the cramped quarters, the old fixtures, the lack of modern amenities that would impress their friends, but they'd never sat in Grandmother Rose's kitchen while she made her famous apple cinnamon bread, learning that the secret ingredient was a splash of vanilla and a pinch of cardamom. They had never walked with her through these streets while she pointed out architectural details and shared stories about the families who'd lived here for generations. They'd never understood that. Sometimes home isn't about space, it's about connection. As dawn light began to creep through my windows, I closed the photo album and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of all those memories. Outside, the city was beginning to stir early commuters heading to subway stations. The corner deli owner rolling up his security gate, the soft hum of traffic building toward the morning rush. My pathetic little hovel was waking up around me. And despite last night's humiliation, despite my family's casual cruelty, I felt that familiar sense of peace that came with being exactly where I belonged. Grandmother Rose had taught me to find value in unexpected places. Maybe it was time I started believing her. I made my morning tea in Grandmother Rose's hand-painted teacup, the one with tiny violets dancing around the rim and hairline crack that ran from the handle to the base like a delicate scar. She'd used this same cup every morning for 30 years, she'd told me once, and the chip on the saucer had happened during the 1977 blackout when she'd stumbled in the dark trying to make tea by candlelight. A little damage doesn't make something worthless, she'd said, tracing the chip with her finger. Sometimes it just makes it more precious because of what it survived. Now, standing in my narrow galley kitchen as morning light filtered through my eastern windows, I understood what she'd meant. My apartment might be small by my family's standards, but it was exactly what I needed, a sanctuary carved out of the city's chaos. A place where every item had been chosen deliberately and held meaning. The kitchen was barely 6 feet long, with just enough room for one person to move comfortably. Most people would have found it claustrophobic, but I loved its efficiency. Everything had its place. The vintage kettle that had been my housewarming gift to myself. The small collection of mismatched mugs I gathered from bookshops and museums. Over the years, the potted herbs growing on the windowsill that I used for cooking and tea. My morning ritual was sacred. Heating water in the kettle instead of the microwave. Measuring loose-leaf Earl Grey into the little silver infuser Grandmother Rose had given me for my 21st birthday, waiting for that perfect moment when the steam began to curl from the spout like incense. While the tea steeped, I padded, barefoot to my living room, which doubled as library, office, and meditation space. The built-in bookshelves that had sold me on this apartment rose from floor to ceiling along the eastern wall, filled with carefully organized volumes. Fiction alphabetical by author on the top shelves, poetry and plays in the middle, nonfiction sorted by subject matter below. Each book had been read at least once, many of them multiple times, their spines softened and familiar under my fingertips. My sofa love seat really Given the space constraints, sat angled to catch both morning light and the view of the small courtyard garden visible through my windows. I'd found it at an estate sale in the village, drawn by its jewel-toned velvet upholstery in the way. Its emerald green seemed to make the whole room feel like a secret garden. The coffee table was actually a trunk I'd discovered at a flea market. Its brass corners tarnished with age, but its wooden surface perfect for holding books. My laptop and the small collection of items that made this place feel like home. A crystal paperweight that threw rainbows across the walls when the afternoon sun hit it just right. A small jade plant that seemed to thrive despite the apartment's limited natural light. And a framed photograph of Grandmother Rose and me from my college graduation. My desk occupied the corner by the western window, positioned to catch the afternoon light that was perfect for reading and writing. It was here that I worked on the children's book I'd been writing for 3 years, a story about a young girl who discovers that her grandmother's garden holds magical secrets. The manuscript lived in neat stacks beside my computer, revised and re-revised until the pages were soft with handling. The bedroom was tiny even by Manhattan standards, just large enough for my double bed and a narrow dresser. But I painted the walls a soft lavender color that reminded me of the twilight hour when Grandmother Rose and I used to sit on our porch, and I'd hung sheer curtains that let in morning light while maintaining privacy from the neighboring buildings. Most people would have seen limitations everywhere they looked. The shower stall in the bathroom was so narrow you had to be careful not to bang your elbows. The closet was barely deep enough for hangers. The entire apartment could be crossed in 12 steps, and you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the thin walls. But what they would have missed was the way the morning sun painted golden rectangles across my bedroom floor, or how the sound of rain on the windows created the perfect backdrop for reading. They wouldn't have noticed the architectural details that spoke of the buildings. 1920s origins, the crown molding around the ceilings, the original hardwood floors with their patina of age, the radiator covers with their Art Deco flourishes. They wouldn't have understood that this apartment was like a perfectly composed poem, every word essential. Nothing extraneous, each element chosen for maximum impact and minimum space. The neighborhood itself was part of the appeal. When I moved here 6 years ago, it was still in transition. The industrial buildings from the area's manufacturing past stood shoulder to shoulder with newer developments, creating an eclectic streetscape that felt both historical and hopeful. Young families pushed strollers past vintage storefronts while artists hauled canvases to converted warehouse studios. Mrs. Chun, who ran the corner market, knew that I preferred green tea in the evenings and always saved the ripest peaches when they came into season. Tommy, the doorman at the luxury building across the street, would wave to me each morning as I walked to the subway, and we developed a friendship based on shared observations about neighborhood characters and changes. There was the elderly man who fed pigeons in the small park every afternoon at 3:30, the young mother who jogged past my window each morning with her twin toddlers in a running stroller, the teenager who practiced violin by an open window and filled the courtyard with Bach and Vivaldi during summer evenings. These people were my community in a way that my family, for all their blood connection, had never been. They saw me as part of the neighborhood fabric, as Anabelle who dash works dash at dash the dash library. Anabelle who dash always dash helps dash carry dash heavy dash packages. Anabelle who dash knows dash which dash books dash the dash local dash kids dash might dash enjoy dot standing in my living room now. Teacup warming my hands, I tried to see my space through Claire's eyes. The narrow galley kitchen where you couldn't open the refrigerator door if someone was standing at the sink. The living room where 2 people could sit comfortably, but 3 would be a crowd. The bedroom where the bed took up 70% of the floor space. 400 square feet of pathetic, according to my sister. But what Claire couldn't see, what none of them could see, was how perfectly those 400 square feet fit me. Every morning I woke up surrounded by books that were like old friends, in a space where every object had been chosen with care and intention. My grandmother's teacup connected me to family history and love. The manuscript on my desk represented dreams and possibility. The view from my windows offered daily reminders that life was happening all around me, full of stories and connections and quiet beauty. This wasn't a starter apartment. or a temporary arrangement until I could afford something real. This was home deliberately chosen, carefully curated, deeply loved Dot. As I settled into my reading chair with my tea and the novel I'd been savoring for the past week, I felt that familiar sense of contentment that came with being exactly where I belonged. Outside, the city hummed with 8 million people rushing toward their own definitions of success and happiness. Inside my pathetic little hovel, I had everything I needed. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's pity for my living situation said more about their values than mine. They measured worth in square footage and status symbols, and the ability to impress and accommodate and display wealth. But Grandmother Rose had taught me different metrics: the quality of light, the presence of beauty, the feeling of peace that comes with being surrounded by things you love rather than things. You think you should want Dot? I sipped my tea from the cracked cup and smiled, thinking of what she would say if she could see me now. Probably something about how the most precious gifts often come in small packages, or how a person who can find joy in 400 square feet has learned. Something about abundance that most people never discover. My phone buzzed with a text message, probably from Claire, with some follow-up comment about last night's dinner conversation. I ignored it, choosing instead to lose myself in the story unfolding in my lap, in the morning light growing stronger across my floor, in the simple pleasure of being home. The restlessness came in waves. One moment I'd be drifting toward sleep, and the next I'd find myself wide awake, Claire's laughter echoing in my mind like a cruel song stuck on repeat. Honestly, Annabelle, when are you going to grow up and get a real place? By 2 a.m, I'd given up any pretense of rest. I padded to the kitchen in my bare feet, the hardwood floors cool against my skin, and made chamomile tea with honey, Grandmother Rose's remedy for sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. The apartment felt different in the pre-dawn hours. More intimate, somehow, as if the darkness had drawn its walls closer around me like a protective embrace. Outside, the city had settled into its quieter rhythm, the occasional taxi horn, the distant rumble of a late-night train, the soft hum of my building's ancient heating system cycling on and off. I settled into my reading chair with the tea and a book of poetry, but my mind kept wandering back to the evening's humiliation. The way my family had looked at me, not with malice, exactly, but with that particular brand of pity reserved for people who've made consistently poor choices. The way they'd assumed that my living situation was a failure of ambition rather than a deliberate choice. Restless energy drove me from the chair to begin what I told myself was light cleaning, but what was really just an excuse to move, to do something with my hands while my thoughts circled. I straightened books that were already perfectly organized, watered plants that didn't need it, reorganized my small collection of vintage postcards for the 3rd time this month. It was while dusting the narrow bookshelf beside my desk that I found a yellowed newspaper clipping that must have slipped from between the pages of one of Grandmother Rose's books when I'd unpacked them. The paper was brittle with age, its edges brown and crumbling, but the headline was still legible. Riverside District, Manhattan's next hot neighborhood. The article was dated 8 years ago, written by some optimistic real estate reporter who'd predicted that my area would be the next Soho within a decade. At the time, it must have seemed like wishful thinking. The neighborhood was still rough around the edges then, more industrial than residential, with plenty of empty storefronts and the kind of gritty urban character that developers usually tried to polish away. But as I read the reporter's predictions, new luxury developments, artist lofts, boutique restaurants, young professionals seeking alternatives to the impossibly expensive downtown markets, I realized with a start that most of them had come true. The warehouse across the street had been converted into million-dollar condos 2 years ago. The empty lot in the corner now housed an organic grocery store that charged $15 for imported olive oil. The coffee shop where I bought my morning pastries had been featured in New York Magazine's Best Hidden Gems list just last month. The article included a sidebar about property values, complete with charts and graphs that meant little to me when I tried to decode them. But one statistic jumped out. The average price per square foot in the area had been $180 when the article was written. I had no idea what my rent was based on property value calculations or beyond my understanding, but something about that Number nagged at me. I set the clipping aside and continued my restless cleaning, but my mind kept returning to it. When had Grandmother Rose clipped this article? And why had she kept it? She'd been in her 80s when this was written, long past the age when most people worried about real estate trends and investment opportunities, unless she'd been thinking about something else entirely. Pulled out my laptop and found myself Googling the current state of my neighborhood's real estate market, falling down a rabbit hole of property listings and market analyses. The numbers were staggering. The luxury building across from me was selling one-bedroom apartments for $2.8 million. A studio in the converted warehouse went for $1.9 million last month. Even the tiny commercial spaces that housed the new boutiques and galleries were commanding rents that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. According to the most recent analysis I could find, the average price per square foot in my area had risen to nearly $900, 5 times what it had been when that reporter wrote his optimistic predictions. I closed the laptop and stared at the newspaper clipping, my grandmother's careful handwriting visible in the margin where she'd written a single word, prescient. Grandmother Rose had always been sharp about people and situations, able to see potential where others saw only problems. She'd been the one to suggest I major in library science when everyone else was pushing me toward more practical fields like business or education. Follow your instincts, Anabelle, she told me. You have a gift for understanding what people really need. Had she seen something in this neighborhood that the rest of us had missed? Some potential that was just beginning to unfold when she'd clipped that article and tucked it away in her books? The questions multiplied as I sat there in the pre-dawn quiet. Why had she encouraged me to look at apartments in this area when I'd been considering places in Queens and Brooklyn? Why had she offered to help with my security deposit, something she'd never done for Claire or Marcus? Why had she seemed so pleased when I told her about finding this particular apartment, almost as if she'd been waiting for exactly that news? You have excellent instincts about place, she'd told me when I described the apartment to her. The morning light, the built-in bookshelves, the sense of possibility I'd felt walking through those 400 square feet. Some people know how to recognize a diamond in the rough. At the time, I thought she was just being supportive, helping me feel better about choosing character over size, charm over convenience. But now, staring at that newspaper clipping with its prescient predictions and her careful annotation, I wondered if there had been more to her encouragement than simple grandmother's pride. The radiator clanked to life, filling the apartment with its familiar metallic song, and I realized that dawn was beginning to creep through my windows. Soon the neighborhood would wake up around me, Mrs. Chun opening her market, Tommy starting his shift across the street, the violin-playing teenager practicing scales before school. But for now, in the quiet hours before the city stirred, I sat, surrounded by questions that felt larger than my sleepless night, larger than my family's casual cruelty, larger than anything I'd allowed myself to consider about my modest life in my pathetic little apartment. Grandmother Rose had left me more than books and teacups and the memory of unconditional love. She'd left me a mystery, hidden in plain sight among her possessions, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I folded the newspaper clipping carefully and placed it inside the front cover of my journal, where I could look at it again in daylight when my thoughts were clearer and the world felt more solid beneath my feet. Outside my window, the first commuters were beginning to appear on the sidewalks, heading towards subway stations and bus stops, carrying their dreams and ambitions and morning coffee toward another day in the city that never slept. And I sat in my 400 square feet of possibility, finally beginning to wonder if maybe there was more to my story than anyone, including myself, had dared to imagine. 3 days later, the newspaper clipping still haunted my thoughts. I'd taken to carrying it with me, tucked inside my daily planner like a talisman, pulling it out during quiet moments at the library to study its faded text and my grandmother's cryptic notation. The children's reading hour had just ended, and I was reshelving picture books when the impulse struck me with sudden clarity. I needed to look through Grandmother Rose's jewelry box, really look, not just the cursory glance I'd given it when I'd inherited her belongings. She'd been a woman who kept important things in unexpected places, who believed that the most precious treasures should be hidden from casual observers. I left work early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely untrue, and practically ran the 6 blocks home. The jewelry box sat in its place of honor on my dresser, its inlaid mother-of-pearl surface catching the afternoon light that slanted through my bedroom window. It was a beautiful piece. Victorian era, Grandmother Rose had told me, passed down from her own grandmother. The wood was dark walnut, polished to a deep luster, with delicate floral patterns inlaid in pearl and silver. When you lifted the lid, a tiny ballerina spun to the tune of Fur Elise, just as she had when I was a child and would beg to wind the music box during my visits. I'd look through it after her funeral, of course, cataloging the modest collection of jewelry she'd left me. Her wedding ring, worn thin from 63 years of marriage. A string of pearls that had been her own mother's. A pair of sapphire earrings my grandfather had given her for their 20th anniversary. A few brooches and pins. The kind of pieces women of her generation collected and wore to church and special occasions. But now, with the newspaper clipping as evidence that she'd been thinking about my neighborhood's future, I examined the box with new attention to detail. The main compartment held the jewelry I remembered, arranged in the small velvet-lined sections, but there were hidden spaces in Victorian jewelry boxes. I'd learned that from reading mystery novels, and Grandmother Rose had been someone who appreciated secrets. I ran my fingers along the edges of the interior, pressing gently, looking for any give in the material. The ballerina continued her mechanical dance. Her pink tutu faded with age. Her painted smile warm but persistent. It was when I lifted the entire mechanism, the platform where the ballerina performed, that I found it. Beneath the music box, workings was a hidden compartment, its existence completely invisible unless you knew to look for it. And inside that compartment was an envelope with my name written in grandmother. Rose's careful cursive script. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The envelope contained 2 items. A letter written on her personal stationery and a folded legal document that looked official and important. I read the letter first, hearing her voice in every word. My dearest Anabelle, if you're reading this, it means you've inherited more than just my jewelry and books. It means you've started asking the right questions, the kind of questions that show you're ready for the truth. I've watched you grow into a woman of substance, despite your family's inability to see your worth. You have your great-grandmother's gift for recognizing beauty in unexpected places, and her wisdom to understand that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be measured in dollars or displayed for others to admire. 6 years ago, when you told me you'd found an apartment in the Riverside district, I knew the time had come to trust you with a secret I've kept for over 30 years. The building you live in, 1247 Riverside Drive, belongs to you. It has belonged to you since the day you were born, held in trust until you were old enough to understand its significance. I purchased that building in 1954 for $8,000, using money I'd saved from working as a seamstress before I married your grandfather. Everyone thought I was foolish. It was a rough neighborhood then, full of factories and boarding houses for immigrant workers. But I could see its potential, the way the light fell on those tree-lined streets, the proximity to the river, the solid bones of the buildings that just needed someone to believe in them. I never told your grandfather, never told your parents, never told anyone. It was my secret investment in the future, not just the financial future, but the future of my family. I knew that someday one of my grandchildren might need a place to start over, to build a life on their own terms, to discover their own strength. That grandchild was you, sweet girl. It was always you. You've been paying rent to yourself for 6 years, though you didn't know it. The money has been collected by my property management company and deposited into an account that will be transferred to your name along with the deed. You'll find the details in the legal documents I've enclosed. The building has 12 units. Yours is the only one occupied by family. The other 11 are rented to tenants who've become like neighbors to you. Mrs. Sheen's son, David, lives in 3B. And Tommy's sister, Maria, has been in 2A since 2019. The rental income has been substantial. And with the neighborhood's recent development, the property's value has grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I made that investment 70 years ago. But more than the money, more than the security this will provide, I want you to understand why I chose you. Your parents love you, but they've never understood that quiet strength is still strength, that choosing contentment over ambition, its own form of success. Claire and Marcus chase after things that glitter, but you've always been drawn to things that last. You saw beauty in 400 square feet because you understand that a home isn't about impressing other people, it's about creating a space where your soul can breathe. You chose to live near my old neighborhood because you value connection over convenience. You've built a life based on meaning rather than status, and that's exactly the kind of person who should be trusted with something this important. The building is yours now, to do with as you see fit. You can sell it if you choose the current market value would ensure you never have to worry about money again. You can continue to rent it as an investment property, or you can do something entirely different, something that reflects your own values and dreams. Whatever you decide, know that you've already made me proud by becoming exactly the person I hoped you'd be: thoughtful, kind, resilient, and true to yourself despite the world's pressure to be someone else. The most precious gifts often come in small packages, my dear. You've taught me that every single day. All my love. Grandmother Rose P.S. The property management company is Henderson and Associates on East 73rd Street. Mr. Henderson Jr. has been expecting your call for 6 years. I set the letter down with trembling hands and unfolded the legal document. It was indeed a deed transferred to Rose Elizabeth Dean Trust, with provisions for the property to pass to Anabelle Rose Dean upon reaching age 30 or upon demonstration of mature judgment and residential choices, whichever comes first. There was a secondary document, a property appraisal dated just last month, commissioned, according to the letterhead, by Henderson and Associates for estate planning purposes. The number at the bottom of the page was so large, I had to read it 3 times to make sure I was seeing it correctly. $8.20. Million. My pathetic little apartment, my 400 square feet of supposed failures, sat atop a piece of Manhattan. Real estate worth more than $8 million. I was not the family disappointment, living in a shoebox. I was a property owner whose building was worth more than all of my siblings' assets combined. The irony was so perfect, so absolutely poetic, that I started laughing. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, until my stomach ached, until the absurdity of it all overwhelmed me completely. Claire's voice echoed in my memory. What do you even do in there? Where do you put anything? What I did in there, it turned out, was live in a multi-million-dollar property that I owned outright. Where I put things was in my own building, surrounded by tenants whose rent had been providing me with an income I'd never known existed. I thought of Marcus asking how I could have people over in such a small space, never imagining that I could invite them to one of the other 11 units in my building if I chose to. I thought of my parents' concern about my practical gifts, their worry that I wasn't building toward a secure future. I was the most financially secure person in my entire family, and none of them, including me, until this moment had any idea. The laughter finally subsided, leaving me feeling hollowed out and strangely peaceful. I picked up Grandmother Rose's letter and read it again, more slowly this time, savoring the love and understanding that radiated from every word. She'd known. Somehow she'd always known that I would need this, not just the financial security, but the validation that my choices had been right all along. That my contentment with small spaces and simple pleasures wasn't a character flaw, but a form of wisdom. That my family's pity had been misplaced from the very beginning. I looked around my apartment, in my building, on my property with new eyes. Every choice I'd made about this space had been an unconscious investment in my own future. Every morning spent drinking tea from Grandmother Rose's cup had been a tribute to the woman who'd made this moment possible. The phone number for Henderson and Associates was printed at the bottom of the appraisal. It was past 5 o'clock. But I dialed anyway, suddenly desperate to confirm that this wasn't an elaborate dream. Henderson and Associates, you've reached our after-hours service. This is Anabelle Dean, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I need to speak with Mr. Henderson Jr. about the Rose Dean Trust. Oh. The voice became immediately warmer. Miss Dean, Mr. Henderson has been hoping to hear from you. Can you hold while I connect you to his direct line? He said to put you through immediately, no matter when you called. The hold music was classical Pachelbel's canon, and I found myself swaying slightly to the familiar melody while I waited. The legal documents spread across my bed like pieces of a puzzle that was finally coming together. "Anabelle!" The voice that came on the line was hearty, enthusiastic. "My God, we've been waiting for this call for years. How are you? Are you sitting down? Because we have so much to discuss." Mr. Henderson Jr., "Call me Robert, please," had a voice like warm honey, the kind of person who probably gave excellent hugs and remembered everyone's birthday. Over the phone, he painted a picture of my grandmother that was both familiar and revelatory. "Your grandmother was one of the sharpest investors I've ever worked with," he said, and I could hear the genuine admiration in his voice. "When my father started managing her property in 1954, everyone thought she'd made a terrible mistake. The Riverside district was barely residential, then mostly warehouses and small manufacturing. But Rose saw something that others missed." I'd pulled up a chair to my desk and was taking notes, trying to process the flood of information he was sharing. Robert had faxed over documents to the library earlier in the week, he told me, anticipating this conversation. There were bank statements, tax records, rental histories, a paper trail that chronicled the building's transformation from my grandmother's unlikely investment to my unexpected inheritance. "She bought the building from the Kowalski family," Robert continued. "They'd owned it since the 1920s, when Polish immigrants lived in tenements and worked in the textile factories nearby. By the 50s, most of the original families had moved to the suburbs, and the building was barely breaking even. Mr. Kowalski was desperate to sell. The property deed was fascinating in its simplicity. Rose Elizabeth Novak, her maiden name, I realized had purchased 1247 Riverside Drive for $8,000 cash. No mortgage, no financing. Just a clean transaction that transferred ownership of a 4-story building containing 12 units from one working-class family to a seamstress who'd saved every penny she could spare. She never told anyone in the family," Robert said. "Not even your grandfather, according to my father's notes. She'd come to our office alone every month to review the books, always wearing those white gloves and carrying a leather handbag that looked like it cost more than most people's cars." I smiled, picturing Grandmother Rose in her formal business attire. She'd always dressed up for important occasions, treating them with the ceremony they deserved. "The neighborhood was rough in those early years," Robert continued. "We had trouble keeping the units rented, lots of turnover, some property damage, but your grandmother was patient. She approved every improvement, every repair, every small upgrade that might attract better tenants. She understood that buildings, like people, need time to reach their potential. The rental records told the story of the neighborhood's gradual transformation. In the 1960s, rents were $45 a month for a 1-bedroom, $65 for a 2-bedroom. By the 1980s, those numbers had climbed to $300 and $450. The 1990s brought the first significant jump, $800 for a 1-bedroom, as young professionals discovered the area's affordable charm and convenient subway access. But it was the last decade that showed the explosive growth Robert had been hinting at. Current rents range from $2,400 for a studio to $4,200 for the largest 2-bedroom unit. The building's annual rental income was now over $380,000. Your grandmother was very specific about how the money should be handled, Robert explained. All rental income after expenses and taxes has been deposited into an investment account in your name. She wanted you to have choices when the time came. The investment account balance made my hands shake. $1.3 million accumulated over 6 years of rent payments I never known I was receiving. But the real value is in the property itself, Robert said. The appraisal we commissioned last month reflects the current market reality. Buildings like yours, pre-war construction, well-maintained, in an increasingly desirable neighborhood, they're gold mines. We've had 3 different developers approach us in the past year alone, wanting to buy for conversion to luxury condos. I thought of the gleaming high-rise across the street, its marble lobby and doorman, and the impossibly wealthy residents I saw walking their designer dogs. My building could become something like that, all glass and steel and astronomical price. Tags. What did my grandmother want me to do with it? I asked. That's the beautiful thing, Robert said, and I could hear his smile through the phone. She left that entirely up to you. Her only instruction was that you should follow your heart and trust your instincts. She believed you'd know what was right when the time came. After we hung up, I sat in my tiny apartment in my multi-million-dollar building, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. The late afternoon sun was slanting through my windows, casting the same golden light. That had drawn me to this place 6 years ago. I pulled out my laptop and began researching the building's history more thoroughly. City records showed that it had been constructed in 1923, part of a wave of residential development that followed the expansion of subway lines into what was then considered the outer reaches of Manhattan. The Kowalski family had indeed owned it for 30 years, renting primarily to immigrant families and factory workers. But what fascinated me was finding a 1952 newspaper article about the neighborhood's future. Industrial district may go residential, read the headline, followed by speculation about the city's plans to rezone the area and encourage residential development. The article quoted several local business owners and residents, including one, Rose Novak, described as a local seamstress and neighborhood advocate. "This area has good bones," the quote attributed to my grandmother read. "The buildings are solid, the transportation is convenient, and there's a sense of community here that you don't find in fancier neighborhoods. Sometimes the best investments are the ones other people overlook." She'd been thinking about this for years before she bought the building. The newspaper clipping I'd found wasn't random. It was part of a pattern of research and planning that stretched back decades, I found. More evidence in the online city archives. Zoning variance applications from the 1960s, all approved, that allow Grandmother Rose to convert some of the larger units into smaller apartments, increasing the building's rental income. Building permit records showing consistent maintenance and improvements, new wiring in 1978, updated plumbing in 1985, roof repairs in 1993. Every decision had been made with long-term thinking, with an understanding that slow, steady improvement would eventually yield extraordinary results. The most remarkable document I found was a letter to the editor that Grandmother Rose had written to the local newspaper in 1987, arguing against a proposed highway expansion that would have cut through the neighborhood. "Our community is not disposable," she'd written. "These buildings house families, not just tenants. These streets hold memories, not just traffic. Progress doesn't require disruption, sometimes it requires patience and the wisdom to nurture what already exists." The highway was never built. The neighborhood continued its gradual transformation from industrial to residential, from working class to middle class, to the increasingly upscale area it was becoming today. Grandmother Rose hadn't just bought a building. She'd invested in a community, in a vision of what the neighborhood could become. And she'd been proven right in ways that even her optimistic heart probably hadn't imagined as evening settled over the city. I made tea in her cup and sat in my reading chair, surrounded by the evidence of her extraordinary foresight. Tomorrow, I would need to make decisions about my newfound wealth and responsibility. I would need to think about what kind of landlord I wanted to be, what kind of legacy I wanted to build with the gift she'd given me. But tonight, I simply wanted to sit in the space she'd chosen for me, in the building she'd entrusted to my care, and feel the presence of the woman who'd believed in me long before I'd learned to believe in myself. Outside my windows, the neighborhood hummed with life, my neighbors coming home from work, children playing in the small park, the familiar rhythm of urban evenings settling over the streets that belonged, in some small but significant way, to me. Grandmother Rose had given me more than financial security. She'd given me roots, responsibility, and the profound knowledge that someone had seen my potential even when I couldn't see it myself. The next morning brought a surreal quality to my usual routine. I made tea in Grandmother Rose's cup, but now I knew that the kitchen where I stood, the apartment around me, the entire building that housed my morning ritual, all of it was mine. The weight of that knowledge felt like carrying a secret too large for my chest. I'd barely slept, my mind spinning with numbers and possibilities, and the sheer impossibility of my situation. $8.2 million in property value. $1.3 million in accumulated rental income. Monthly revenue that exceeded my annual library salary. The mathematics of my new reality refused to settle into something I could comprehend. At work, I moved through my tasks with a disconnected feeling of watching someone else's life. During the children's story hour, I read The Little Red Hen, with particular attention to the themes of hard work and unexpected rewards, wondering if the 4-year-olds could sense the irony. But by lunchtime, the need for concrete information had overwhelmed my ability to pretend this was just another day. I called Robert Henderson and arranged to meet at his office that afternoon. "Bring identification and be prepared to sign some paperwork," he'd said cheerfully. "It's time to make this official." Henderson and Associates occupied a narrow townhouse on East 73rd Street, the kind of place that whispered old money and established families. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and impeccable posture, greeted me like I was expected royalty. "Ms. Dean, we're so delighted to finally meet you. Mr. Anderson has been looking forward to this day for years." Robert Henderson Jr. was exactly what his voice had suggested, a bear of a man with warm eyes and laugh lines, probably in his early 50s, wearing a rumpled suit that suggested he cared more about substance than style. His office was cramped, with filing cabinets and family photographs, legal books stacked on every available surface. "Your grandmother was my father's favorite client," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Not because of the money, though the account was certainly substantial, but because of her character. She asked intelligent questions, made thoughtful decisions, and never once complained about the work involved in maintaining property. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Dean Rose Elizabeth Trust Account and spread its contents across his desk. Bank statements dating back 6 years, detailed rental records, maintenance reports, tax documents, the paper trail of my secret inheritance. "Let's start with the basics," Robert said, pulling out a calculator and a legal pad. "Your building generates approximately $380,000 annually in rental income. After property taxes, maintenance, insurance, and management fees, the net income is roughly $280,000 per year." I stared at him. My annual salary at the library was $52,000. My building earned more than 5 times that amount while I slept. "The money has been accumulating in a high-yield investment account, as your grandmother instructed. She was very specific, but you shouldn't receive any income until you took official ownership. She wanted you to understand the responsibility before you enjoyed the benefits." He showed me the investment statements, portfolios of conservative funds and municipal bonds that had grown steadily over the years. Even during market downturns, the account had maintained its value through careful, patient investing. The same philosophy Grandmother Rose had applied to the building itself. "Now for the property valuation," Robert continued, pulling out the formal appraisal. "The building sits on a lot that's 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep. In this neighborhood, that's worth approximately $4.8 million just for the land. The building itself, well-maintained pre-war construction with original architectural details, adds another $3.4 million to the total value." He walked me through the breakdown. 12 units ranging from 400 to 800 square feet, all currently occupied by long-term tenants paying below market rents. "Your grandmother was very particular about tenant relations," he explained. "She believed that stable tenants were worth more than maximum rents. Most of these people have lived in the building for years." I thought of Mrs. Chun's son, David, whom I'd seen in the lobby countless times. Of Maria, Tommy's sister, who sometimes helped me carry groceries. These weren't just numbers on a rental statement. They were my neighbors, people whose lives were interconnected with mine in ways I was only beginning to understand. "What are my obligations?" I asked. "As the property owner, you're responsible for maintenance, repairs, compliance with city regulations, and tenant relations. We can continue to manage those details for you as we did for your grandmother, or you can take a more hands-on approach. Some owners prefer to be involved in day-to-day decisions." The paperwork was extensive but straightforward. Transfer of property deed, bank account authorizations, tax documentation. Each signature felt momentous, like stepping across a threshold I could never cross back over. "There's one more thing," Robert said as I finished the last form. We've had several serious inquiries about purchasing the building. Developers, investors, even a celebrity who wants to convert it into a single-family mansion. The highest offer so far has been $12 million. $12 million for my pathetic little apartment building. Your grandmother's instructions were very clear, he continued. Any decisions about selling should be entirely yours, based on your own values and priorities. She trusted your judgment completely. Walking home from his office, I felt like I was moving through a dream. The city looked the same, the familiar streets, the afternoon rush of people heading home from work, the late summer light painting, everything golden. But my relationship to all of it had fundamentally changed. I wasn't just another working professional commuting back to her small apartment. I was a property owner, a landlord, someone with assets and income and decisions to make that would affect not just my own life, but the lives of 11 other households. The building looked different as I approached it. 2. What I'd always seen as a modest, well-maintained structure now revealed itself as a significant piece of Manhattan real estate. The architectural details I'd appreciated aesthetically, the carved stone lintels above the windows, the decorative ironwork on the fire escapes, the solid brick construction now represented value in ways I'd never considered. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the front steps when I arrived, something she did every evening as part of her contribution to the building's upkeep. She smiled and waved, just as she had hundreds of times before, but now I knew that she was waving to her landlord. How are you, Anabelle? You look tired today. I'm fine, Mrs. Chen. Just a long day at work. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I climbed the stairs to my apartment in my building, carrying the weight of knowledge that felt too large for one person to hold alone. Inside, I spread the documents across my dining table and stared at them until the numbers began to blur. $8 million in property. Over $1 million in accumulated income. Monthly revenue that could change my life in ways I couldn't even imagine. But perhaps the most overwhelming realization was this. Grandmother Rose had known exactly who I was and what I would become even when I hadn't known it myself. She'd seen past my family's dismissive attitudes and my own self-doubt to recognize someone worthy of this extraordinary trust. The responsibility felt enormous, but so did the gift. For the first time in my life, I had real choices, not just about money, but about the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of impact I wanted to have, the kind of legacy I wanted to build. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I made dinner in my small kitchen and ate it while reading through the rental agreements. Each lease told a story. David Chen, graduate student in architecture. Maria Santos, elementary school teacher. Robert Kim, freelance graphic designer. People like me building modest lives in the city, probably never imagining that their young, quiet landlord living on the 4th floor was facing decisions that could change all their lives. Tomorrow, I would need to start thinking about what kind of landlord I wanted to be, what kind of neighbor, what kind of steward of Grandmother Rose's legacy. But tonight, I simply sat in my transformed apartment, surrounded by the evidence of her extraordinary gift, and tried to believe that I was worthy of the faith she placed in me. The next family gathering was Mom's birthday dinner, held at their house in Westchester 2 weeks later. I drove up in my 8-year-old Honda Civic, parking behind Claire's BMW and Marcus's Range Rover in the circular driveway, carrying a gift bag that contained a first edition poetry book I'd found at a rare books dealer and a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. The knowledge of my true financial situation sat in my chest like a secret that glowed, making every interaction feel charged with hidden meaning. As I hugged my parents hello and complimented Mom on her new haircut, I found myself studying my family with the detached fascination of an anthropologist. Dad looked tired in a way that seemed deeper than simple aging. At 70, he should have been enjoying retirement, but I noticed the financial newspapers scattered across his home office desk, the way he frowned when examining bills, the subtle tension that appeared whenever conversation turned to money. How is the market treating you these days? Marcus asked him over cocktails, and I saw Dad's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Oh, ups and downs, nothing we can't handle. But I was listening with new ears now, and I heard the uncertainty beneath his reassuring words. The stock market had been volatile lately, and I suddenly wondered how much of their retirement savings was at risk, how secure their golden years actually were. Claire arrived characteristically late, her heels clicking against the marble foyer floor with that familiar announcement of her presence. She looked impeccable as always, designer dress, perfect makeup, hairstyled in effortless waves that probably took an hour to achieve. But there was something brutal about her perfection. Tonight, a tension around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Sorry, she breathed, distributing air kisses. Work has been absolutely insane. The Henderson account is killing me. She accepted a glass of wine from Dad and immediately took a large sip, her movements just slightly too quick, too sharp. When Mom asked about her latest promotion, Claire's laugh had an edge that hadn't been there at Dad's birthday dinner. Oh, that. Well, turns out the promotion comes with about 50% more responsibility and maybe 10% more pay. You know how it is, they're restructuring everything, which basically means doing more work for the same money. Marcus! And Sarah arrived shortly after, and I watched their interactions with the same heightened attention. Sarah's smile seemed strained as she complimented Mom's renovated kitchen, and when Marcus mentioned their house hunting adventures, I noticed how Sarah's hand tightened on her wine glass. We've expanded our search to include some areas a bit further out, Marcus said, his tone carefully casual. Turns out our budget doesn't go quite as far as we thought in today's market. Interest rates, Dad said sympathetically. They're murder right now. Among other things, Sarah murmured, so quietly I almost missed it. Dinner conversation flowed around the usual topics: work, family news, local politics, but I found myself picking up undercurrents I never noticed before. Claire's mentions of her mortgage payments were just a little too frequent, delivered with just a little too much emphasis on how manageable they were. Marcus discussed their delayed house purchase with the forced optimism of someone making the best of a disappointing situation, even Mom and Dad, despite their comfortable suburban home and established routines, showed signs of financial stress. Mom mentioned that they decided to postpone their planned trip to Italy, citing timing issues that sounded suspiciously like budget concerns. Maybe next year, Dad said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes' dot as the evening progressed. I began to understand that the displays of wealth I'd always envied: Claire's designer clothes, Marcus's luxury car, my parents' renovated kitchen, might be more about image than substance. The BMW could be leased. The Range Rover might come with payments that strained their budget. The kitchen renovation could have been financed with credit that was still being paid off. It was Claire who inadvertently confirmed my suspicions. After her third glass of wine, she was more candid than usual, complaining about the cost of living in the city, the pressure to maintain a certain image in her industry, the difficulty of saving money when every client meeting required expensive restaurants and every work event demanded a new outfit. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it, she said, swirling her wine morosely. I mean, what's the point of making good money if it all disappears into rent and car payments and keeping up appearances? She looked around the table, her gaze settling on me with that familiar mix of pity and condescension. At least Anabelle doesn't have to worry about any of that stuff. No pressure to impress anyone, no image to maintain. Must be nice to live so simply. The irony was so profound I almost choked on my wine. Here was my sister, drowning in the financial pressures of maintaining her successful image, envying me for what she perceived as my freedom from material concerns. If only she knew that I could buy her BMW with the rental income from 2 months in my building. Simple can be good, I managed to say, my voice carefully neutral. Exactly, Claire continued, warming to her theme. No mortgage stress, no car payments, no pressure to dress for success. Just your little apartment and your books and your quiet life. Honestly, sometimes I'm jealous. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Trust me, sis, there are definitely advantages to not having financial responsibilities. Sarah and I are looking at 30-year mortgage, and wondering if we'll ever actually own anything outright. The American dream, Sarah said dryly. Work your whole life to maybe pay off a house by the time you're 60. I sat quietly, absorbing. The revelation that my family's apparent success was built on a foundation of debt and financial anxiety. They were all trapped in cycles of earning and spending, working harder to afford lifestyles that brought them stress rather than satisfaction. Meanwhile, I owned property worth $8 million and had never felt more financially secure in my life when Claire started discussing her latest client dinner at $200 meal that she had to pay for herself because the expense account was under review. I found myself doing mental calculations. That single dinner cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and she was complaining about having to repeat the experience weekly. The rental income from my building could cover a $200 dinner every single day and still leave money left over. As the evening wound down and we said our goodbyes, I hugged each family member with a strange mix of affection and detachment. I loved them, but I was beginning to understand that their values and mine might be more different than I'd ever realized. They were chasing external markers of success, accumulating possessions and experiences that required constant financial pressure to maintain. I had stumbled or been guided into a form of wealth that supported the quiet, meaningful life I'd always preferred. Driving home through the darkened suburbs, my modest car carrying me back to my modest apartment in my immodest building, I thought about Grandmother Rose's wisdom in choosing me as her heir. She understood that wealth could be a trap as easily as a gift, that the wrong person might use it to chase after bigger versions of the same pressures that were currently making my family miserable. But she'd also understood that the right person might use it to build something better, a life based on contentment rather than comparison, on security rather than status, on the freedom to choose meaning over money. Back in my apartment, I made tea in her cup and sat by my windows, looking out at the neighborhood that belonged, in some small but significant way, to me. Tomorrow, I would need to decide what kind of wealthy person I wanted to be. But tonight, I simply marveled at the extraordinary gift of seeing my family's struggles clearly for the first time, and understanding how differently our stories were unfolding than any of us had ever imagined. The revelation about my family's financial struggles consumed my thoughts for days. I found myself researching their circumstances with the same methodical attention I've once applied to helping library patrons track down obscure references. But instead of hunting through databases and archives, I was piecing together a puzzle from overheard phone conversations, social media posts, and the small details that people reveal when they don't think anyone is paying attention. It started accidentally. I was having lunch at a cafe near my library when I spotted Marcus at a corner table, hunched over his laptop with papers spread around him like he was conducting war strategy. His usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked harried, almost desperate, occasionally running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as stress. I was far enough away that he didn't notice me, which gave me an unobstructed view of his phone conversation when it rang. Even across the cafe noise, I could hear the tension in his voice. "No, I understand the deadline," he was saying, his free hand gripping his coffee cup so tightly I was surprised it didn't crack. "But the Johnson project fell through and the Williamson account is delayed until next quarter. I just need another 30 days. There was a long pause while he listened, his face growing paler. 6 months behind? That's not possible. We've been making payments. Another pause, shorter this time. I see. Yes, I'll have the documentation to you by Friday. When he hung up, he sat staring at his phone for a full minute before carefully gathering his papers and leaving without finishing his lunch. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I Googled my own brother. What I found painted a picture that was drastically different from the successful consultant image he projected at family dinners. Marcus had started his consulting firm 3 years ago with significant fanfare, leaving a stable corporate job to pursue what he called entrepreneurial freedom. The company website was slick and professional, full of stock photos and vague descriptions of strategic solutions and innovative approaches. But deeper digging revealed a different story. The business registration showed multiple address changes, which suggested either rapid growth or instability. Recent client testimonials were sparse, and the case study section hadn't been updated in over a year. Most telling was a legal document I found buried in county court records. A breach of contract suit filed against Marcus's company 6 months ago by a client, claiming non-delivery of promised services. The financial picture became clearer when I found his company's Better Business Bureau listing, which included several complaints about delayed project completion and communication issues. One client had written a detailed review describing how Marcus had overpromised on deliverables and then become increasingly difficult to reach his deadlines. It explained the expensive car and the talk of house hunting Marcus was, living on the money from new clients while struggling to deliver results to existing ones. A classic symptom of a business that was growing too fast to maintain quality. Sarah's situation was equally revealing, though it took more detective work to uncover. Her social media presence was carefully curated beautiful photos of their apartment, artfully arranged restaurant meals, weekend trips to the Hamptons with friends who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. But I noticed patterns that suggested financial strain beneath the glamorous surface. The designer handbags appeared and disappeared with suspicious frequency, suggesting rental or resale rather than ownership. The restaurant photos were often taken at lunch rather than dinner, when prices were lower. The weekend trips were usually day trips rather than overnight stays. More importantly, I found evidence of her side hustles. Sarah had a discreetly managed Instagram account where she sold jewelry and accessories, and a profile on a freelance website offering social media management services. These weren't the activities of someone who was financially secure. They were the desperate scrambling of someone trying to generate additional income streams. The most damning evidence came from a conversation I accidentally overheard when I was visiting my parents the following weekend. I'd arrived early and was reading in the garden when Marcus and Sarah pulled into the driveway. They sat in their car for several minutes before coming inside, apparently finishing a heated discussion. "We can't keep this up," Sarah was saying, her voice carrying clearly through their open windows. "The credit cards are maxed out, Marcus. We're paying minimum balances with money we don't have." "The Henderson deal will come through," Marcus replied, but even he didn't sound convinced. "And if it doesn't, there's always the family option." "You mean asking your parents for money?" "Marcus, they're retired. They shouldn't have to bail us out because you can't manage your business properly." "Not my parents," Marcus said, and something in his tone made me sit up straighter. "Anabelle." There was a long silence before Sarah spoke again. "Anabelle?" "Marcus, she's a librarian. She probably makes less than I do at the gallery." "Exactly. Which means she has no expenses. No mortgage, no car payments, no image to maintain. She's probably got money sitting in savings accounts, earning nothing. A small loan would help us get back on our feet, and she'd probably be grateful for the chance to contribute to the family." The casual presumption in his voice that my savings existed for their convenience, that I would be grateful to help fund their lifestyle, left me breathless with anger. "That seems wrong," Sarah said quietly. "Taking money from your sister. Because we can't manage our own finances." "It's not taking," Marcus replied with the smooth confidence that had always made him the family charmer. "It's family helping family. And honestly, what else is she going to do with whatever she saved? At least this way it would go towards something productive." They got out of the car then, transforming instantly into the successful, confident couple they presented to the world. Marcus straightened his shoulders and smiled broadly as they approached the house. Sarah touched up her lipstick and adjusted her designer scarf. The one I now suspected was borrowed or rented. Watching them perform their successful couple routine for our parents' benefit, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at their presumption, that my money was somehow available for their use. Sadness at seeing how desperately they were struggling beneath their polished exterior. And a growing understanding of why Grandmother Rose had been so specific about keeping my inheritance secret. Over dinner, Marcus and Sarah performed their parts perfectly. Marcus talked enthusiastically about his expanding client base and the exciting opportunities on the horizon. Sarah showed off her new bracelet, probably borrowed. I now realized, and described their latest weekend adventure in the Hamptons, but I was watching for the tells now, and they were everywhere. The way Marcus's smile faltered when Dad asked specific questions about his business revenue. How Sarah's hand trembled slightly when she reached for her wine glass. The forced quality of their laughter, the too bright energy that screamed of. People working very hard to convince themselves, as much as their audience. "We're actually looking at expanding," Marcus announced during dessert, his voice carrying that particular brand of optimism that comes from someone trying to manifest success through sheer force of will. Maybe bringing on a partner or someone with complementary skills and, additional capital. Dad nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. Growth requires investment. Exactly. And sometimes family is the best source of that kind of support. Marcus's eyes flickered toward me for just a moment before returning to Dad. People who believe in your vision, who want to see you succeed. The setup was so obvious, so carefully orchestrated, that I almost admired its craftsmanship. He was laying the groundwork for asking me for money, creating a narrative where helping fund his failing business would be presented as a family investment, opportunity rather than a desperate plea for financial rescue. What he didn't know none of them knew was that I could write him a check for whatever amount he needed without even touching my principal assets. The monthly rental income from my building was more than enough to cover what I suspected he owed. But Grandmother Rose's letter echoed in my mind. You have your great-grandmother's gift for recognizing beauty in unexpected places, and her wisdom to understand that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be measured in dollars. Money wouldn't solve Marcus's problems because his problems weren't really about money. They were about values, about the choices he'd made to prioritize image over substance, about building a life on a foundation of debt and pretense rather than genuine accomplishment. Getting him money would only enable him to dig himself deeper into the same patterns that had created his current crisis. As the evening progressed, I found myself studying each family member with new eyes. Mom, describing her volunteer work at the hospital with genuine enthusiasm, but then mentioning how they'd had to decline a charity gala invitation because the ticket prices had become a bit much. Dad, proud of his retirement but clearly anxious about market volatility and the sustainability of their fixed income. Even Claire, when she called during dessert to apologize for missing dinner, sounded strained. Through the speakerphone, her voice had that brittle quality I'd noticed at Mom's birthday. And when she mentioned working late again, I heard exhaustion rather than dedication. They were all struggling in their own ways, all trapped in lifestyles that required more resources than they actually possessed. And they were all looking at me, quiet, modest, uncomplicated Anabelle as a potential solution to problems they were too proud to acknowledge directly. The irony was staggering. Here I sat, surrounded by family members who were drowning in financial stress, while possessing wealth that could solve all their problems with room to spare. But the same wisdom that had guided Grandmother Rose's investment decisions 60 years ago told me that writing checks wouldn't address the deeper issues. Marcus needed to learn how to run a sustainable business rather than a flashy one. Claire needed to find work that fulfilled her rather than just impressed others. My parents needed to adjust their expectations to match their retirement reality rather than their pre-retirement lifestyle. And perhaps most importantly, they all needed to learn the difference between wealth and the appearance of wealth, something I was only beginning to understand myself. After dinner, as we said our goodbyes, Marcus lingered by my car. Annie, we should get together soon, he said, his casual tone not quite masking the calculated nature of the suggestion. Maybe grab lunch, catch up on things. I'd love to hear more about how you're doing. I smiled, understanding exactly what how you're doing meant in this context. It meant how much money I had available, how willing I might be to help family in need, how naive I was about business opportunities that could benefit us both. That sounds nice, Marcus. But I'm pretty busy at work these days. Maybe in a few weeks? The disappointment that flickered across his face confirmed my suspicions. He'd been hoping to accelerate his timeline, probably because whatever financial deadline he was facing was more urgent than he'd let on. Driving home, I thought about the evening's revelations and what they meant for my future relationship with my family. They saw me as a resource to be tapped, a problem solver who existed outside the pressures they faced. They had no idea that I was facing pressures of my own, not financial ones, but the weight of responsibility that came with unexpected wealth and the knowledge that my choices could affect many people's lives. Back in my apartment, I pulled out the folder of documents Robert Henderson had given me and spread them across my dining table. Property tax records, maintenance schedules, tenant lease agreements, the practical details of my inheritance that required decisions I was still learning. How to make dot tomorrow. I would need to meet with the building's superintendent about upgrading the heating system. Next week, I had appointments with accountants and financial advisors to discuss investment strategies for my accumulated rental income. I was learning about depreciation schedules and capital improvements, about my responsibilities as a landlord, and my opportunities as an investor. These were real problems, complex decisions that would affect real people. They were also problems that my family couldn't solve with their charm or connections or credit cards. I was beginning to understand that Grandmother Rose hadn't just given me money, she'd given me the chance to build something meaningful, to be the kind of person who creates value rather than just consuming it. My family, for all their apparent sophistication, was still playing by the old rules, working hard to afford things that would impress other people, measuring success by external markers that required constant financial pressure to maintain. But I had been handed a different kind of opportunity, the chance to opt out of that system entirely, to build wealth that served my values rather than undermining them, to create security that was real rather than performed. As I prepared for bed in my tiny apartment worth millions of dollars, I felt a profound gratitude for the woman who'd seen this possibility in me long before. I'd seen it in myself. The family that paid my simple life had no idea how rich it really was. 3 weeks later, while organizing Grandmother Rose's books for donation to the library's annual sale, I discovered her journal tucked between volumes of Dickens and Austen. The leather cover was worn soft from years of handling, and my name was written on a small label affixed to the front cover in her careful script. I found many of her books contained personal inscriptions, pressed flowers, handwritten notes, bookmarks made from ribbon and lace. But the journal felt different, more intentional, like she'd specifically placed it where I would eventually find it. The entries dated back 20 years, beginning shortly after my grandfather's death, when she'd been facing her own questions about legacy and family. Reading her private thoughts felt intimate in a way that even her letter hadn't prepared me for. This was the unguarded voice of a woman wrestling with complex decisions about love and money and responsibility. June 15th. Watched Anabelle at Claire's graduation party today. While everyone else celebrated loudly, she sat quietly in the corner reading to the neighbor's 5-year-old daughter. The child was fussy and bored, but Annie transformed her completely with a story about brave mice and magical libraries. She has such a gift for seeing what people need and providing it without fanfare. August 3rd, Claire called asking for help with her apartment deposit. I gave her the money, of course, but I noticed she spent more on her graduation celebration than she was asking me to contribute to her future. She sees money as something to be used for impression rather than foundation. I worry about what kind of woman she's becoming. October 12th, Marcus made varsity football. The whole family went to watch him play, but Annie stayed home to help Mrs. Kowalski next door with her garden. She said she didn't mind missing the game because Marcus has plenty of people cheering for him already. How does a 16-year-old develop such wisdom about where her attention is truly needed? The entries painted a picture of my grandmother, watching our family dynamics with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who understood that character was more important than achievement. She'd seen patterns that the rest of us had missed or chosen to ignore. March 22nd, Annie's college graduation. Her parents barely stayed for the ceremony, something about Marcus's tournament. But her thesis advisor sought me out specifically to tell me that Annie's research on community literacy programs was the most thoughtful work she'd seen in years. Your granddaughter understands that libraries aren't about books, she said. They're about people. I wanted to tell her that Annie understands most things are really about people. Reading these observations, I felt simultaneously seen and exposed. Grandmother Rose had been documenting my character development like a scientist studying an interesting specimen, but with the loving attention of someone who genuinely cared about the outcome. September 8th, made my decision about the building. Today, Annie chose that neighborhood not because it was fashionable or convenient, but because it felt like home. She walks those streets the way I used to walk them, noticing details, greeting neighbors, understanding that community is something you create rather than something you find. If anyone can turn that property into something meaningful rather than just profitable, it's her. The entry was dated 3 months after I'd moved into my apartment. She'd been planning this gift almost from the moment I'd signed my lease, watching to see if I would treat the neighborhood as a temporary stop or a real home. December 24th, Christmas dinner. Claire complained about her tiny kitchen, which is twice the size of my first apartment, while Annie helped wash dishes in my actually tiny kitchen and said she loved how efficient the space was. Everything has its place, she said, and you don't waste motion or time looking for things. She sees abundance where others see limitation. This is the person who should inherit abundance, someone who already understands its true value. But it was the later entries that revealed the full depth of her planning. She'd been researching property management companies, interviewing financial advisors, even consulting with lawyers about trust structures that would protect my inheritance from family pressure. February 10th, met with Robert Henderson Jr. today about succession planning. He understands that money can be a burden as easily as a blessing, especially for someone who's never had it. We're structuring everything so Annie will have support and guidance without feeling overwhelmed. She need time to grow into this responsibility. May 15th, watched Annie at the neighborhood block party today. She knew everyone's names, remembered details about their children and jobs and concerns. Mrs. Chen introduced her as the young lady who always helps carry my groceries. The man from the corner bookstore called her the customer who special orders books for other people's children. She's not just living in that community, she's contributing to it. This is exactly what I hoped would happen. The final entries, written in the months before her death, revealed her growing confidence in her choice. August 3rd, Annie called to tell me about the children's reading program she's developing at the library. She's so excited about reaching kids who don't have books at home, about creating programs that serve working parents and immigrant families. She could have taken a job at a university library with more prestige and better pay, but she chose to work where she can make the biggest difference. This is why the building should be hers, not just because she deserves security, but because she'll use that security to serve others. November 12th, last family dinner before my surgery. Claire spent most of the evening talking about her new car, and Marcus described his plans to flip houses for profit. Annie asked thoughtful questions about everyone else's lives and said very little about her own. When I asked about her writing, she brushed it off as just a little project. Later, I found her story draft on my kitchen table. She'd been reading it to me earlier and forgot to take it home. It's beautiful, full of wisdom about finding magic. In ordinary places, she doesn't see her own gifts, but others do. The children she reads to, the neighbors she helps, the library patrons who seek her out specifically because she really listens to what they need. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before her death. December 1st. Made my peace with this decision. Annie will be surprised, probably overwhelmed, maybe even frightened by the responsibility. But she's the only one who might use wealth to build something better rather than just something bigger. Claire and Marcus chase after the appearance of success, but Annie has always been interested in the substance of a meaningful life. The building will give her choices not just about money, but about what kind of person she wants to become with those choices. I trust her to choose well. I closed the journal and sat in the growing dusk of my apartment, feeling the weight of her confidence in me. She hadn't left me money because she pitied my modest circumstances. She'd left it because she believed I was the kind of person who would honor the gift by using it wisely. But what did that look like in practice? How did someone honor a legacy this significant while staying true to the values that had earned the legacy in the first place? The questions that had been swirling in my mind for weeks suddenly felt more urgent. I had financial advisors telling me about investment opportunities that could double my wealth within a decade. I had developers calling daily with offers to buy the building for sums that would set me up for life. I had family members circling closer, sensing opportunity without understanding its true scope, and I had Grandmother Rose's journal filled with observations about character and community and the difference between wealth that serves and wealth that corrupts. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Claire, her voice bright with the particular enthusiasm that usually preceded. A request! Annie? I'm so glad I caught you. Listen, I've been thinking about what we discussed at Mom's birthday about how nice it must be to live so simply without all the financial pressure the rest of us face. I hadn't discussed anything of the sort, but I let her continue. The thing is, I'm in a bit of a situation. Nothing serious, just a temporary cash flow issue with some credit card payments. I was wondering if you might be able to help me out, just a small loan, maybe a couple $1,000s. I'd pay you back with interest, of course. A couple $1,000s, less than a week's rental income from my building. What kind of situation? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Oh, you know how it is. Work expenses that haven't been reimbursed yet. Some unexpected car repairs, just the usual stuff that adds up. But if I don't get caught up on these payments, it could affect my credit score, and that would be a disaster for my career. The casual way she assumed I had thousands of dollars available for loans told me everything I needed to know about how my family saw me. Not as someone struggling to make ends meet, but as someone whose lack of expensive tastes meant I must have money sitting around unused. I'll have to think about it, I said carefully. Of course. No pressure at all. It's just that the payment is due on Friday, and I thought maybe we could get together this week. She was interrupted by another call coming through. Oh, that's my boss. Can I call you back? But think about it, okay? It would really save my life. After she hung up, I sat holding the phone and thinking about the choice in front of me. I could help Claire just as I could help Marcus when he finally worked up the courage to ask. A few thousand here, maybe 10,000 their amounts that would barely register in my monthly budget, but could solve their immediate crises. But Grandmother Rose's journal made it clear that she'd chosen me specifically because she believed I would make difficult choices based on long-term wisdom rather than short-term kindness. Enabling my siblings' financial mismanagement wouldn't help them build better lives. It would just delay the reckoning they needed to face about their unsustainable spending patterns. The real question wasn't whether I should give them money. The real question was what I should do with the extraordinary gift I'd been given. How to build something that would honor Grandmother Rose's faith in my character while creating genuine value for my community. Outside my windows, the neighborhood was settling into its evening rhythm. Children called to each other in the small park across the street. Mrs. Chun was closing her market, probably counting the day's receipts and planning tomorrow's orders. The teenager who practiced violin was warming up for her evening practice session. This was the community that Grandmother Rose had invested in 70 years ago, that she'd entrusted to my care. These are the people whose lives intersected with mine in small but meaningful ways every day. Whatever I decided to do with my inheritance, it should serve this community first, not my family's convenience, not developers' profit margins, not even my own comfort. For the first time since discovering my inheritance, I felt the beginning of clarity about what that might mean. Claire's request came sooner than I'd expected, dressed in the casual language of family obligation, but carrying an urgency that suggested her situation was more desperate than she'd initially let on. The group text arrived on a Tuesday morning. While I was having breakfast, family chat time. Can everyone get together this weekend? I need to run something by you all. Dad responded first. Everything okay, sweetheart? Just some financial planning stuff, Claire wrote back. Nothing serious, but I could use some family wisdom. Marcus chimed in with obvious relief. Perfect timing. Sarah and I have been wanting to discuss some investment opportunities with everyone too. I stared at my phone, understanding immediately that this was the moment when my family would reveal the full extent of their expectations about my role as their financial safety net. They'd probably coordinated this, maybe even planned it as a group intervention where collective family pressure would make it harder for me to say. No. Mom responded with motherly concern. Should we be worried? You know, your father and I are. Here to help however we can. No, Claire replied quickly. Actually, this is more about helping each other. Pooling resources and family support systems. The phrase pooling resources made my stomach clench. They weren't just planning to ask me for money, they were planning to present it as some kind of mutual family investment scheme, where my contribution would be framed as participation rather than charity. Over the following days, the text continued, with the orchestrated casualness of people working very hard to seem spontaneous. Marcus mentioned his business opportunities. Claire talked about her career advancement plans. Sarah shared articles about family financial planning and the importance of leveraging collective strength. By Thursday, the picture was clear. They constructed a narrative where my modest lifestyle wasn't a choice, but a missed opportunity, where my supposed savings represented resources that could benefit the whole family through strategic investment and mutual support. The irony was breathtaking. Here they were, preparing to ask me for financial help based on their assumption that I was financially naive, while I sat on assets that exceeded their combined net worth by several $1,000,000. Friday afternoon brought Claire's follow-up call, her voice carrying that particular blend of vulnerability and manipulation that she'd perfected over the years. Annie, I'm so glad we're getting together this weekend. I've been thinking a lot about family and how we can support each other better. She paused, clearly reading from some kind of script she'd prepared. You've always been so smart about money living within your means, not getting caught up in the spending trap that the rest of us fall into. The compliment was obviously designed to soften me up for what was coming next. The thing is, Marcus and I have been talking, and we realized that while we've been struggling with cash flow and investment decisions, you've probably been able to save quite a bit by living so modestly. And we thought maybe there's a way for all of us to benefit from that. She was hitting every note, perfectly acknowledging my wisdom, while simultaneously suggesting that I'd been wasting opportunities, positioning herself and Marcus as the sophisticated investors who could help me do something productive with my money. What kind of benefits? I asked, though I already knew. Well, Marcus has some really exciting business opportunities that need capital investment. Short-term loans, really, with guaranteed returns. And I'm looking at some career moves that require upfront investment but would pay off hugely in the long run. Guaranteed returns. Career investments. The language of people who'd been watching too many entrepreneurship videos and convincing themselves that their financial problems were really just undercapitalized opportunities. And you think I have money to invest? Not invest exactly. More like ... family support. The way families help each other succeed. Your savings could help us get to the next level, and then we'd all benefit from the growth. There was the central assumption that my money existed for their advancement, that my financial stability was somehow selfish unless it served their ambitions. How much money do you think I have, Claire? The question seemed to catch her off guard. I mean, I don't know exactly, but you don't have a mortgage or car payments or any of the expensive lifestyle stuff the rest of us deal with. You must have at least, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30,000 saved up. That kind of money could make a huge difference for Marcus's business, and you'd be part of something really exciting instead of just letting it sit in a savings account earning nothing, $20,000 or $30,000. She was preparing to ask me for what amounted to pocket change compared to my actual wealth, but it represented a sum that could fundamentally change their lives if managed properly. And what would I get out of this arrangement? You'd be investing in family. Plus, Marcus's business projections show potential returns of 15 to 20% annually. That's way better than any savings account or CD. Marcus's failing business that was currently being sued for breach of contract and couldn't meet its existing obligations. The business that had him sitting in coffee shops desperately negotiating with creditors. I'll think about it, I said, using the same words I'd given her before. Of course. But Annie, the opportunity is pretty time sensitive. If we're going to move forward, we'd need to discuss specifics this weekend. After she hung up, I sat in my apartment in my $8 million building and felt the full weight of the choice in front of me. I could solve their problems with a single check that would barely register in my monthly budget. I could be the generous sister who saved the day, who proved that family comes first, who used her unexpected good fortune to lift up the people she loved. But Grandmother Rose's journal lay open on my coffee table, filled with observations about character and wisdom and the difference between helping and enabling. She'd written about watching me choose service over recognition, substance over appearance, long-term meaning over short-term gratification. She'd also written about watching Claire and Marcus make choices that prioritized image over sustainability, consumption over creation, taking over giving. Lending them money wouldn't teach them to make better choices, it would simply give them more resources to make the same poor choices on a larger scale. That evening, I found myself walking through my neighborhood with new attention to detail. Mrs. Chun's market, where she worked 16-hour days to support her son's education. The small park where working parents brought their children after long days at jobs that barely covered their rent. The community garden where neighbors collaborated to grow fresh vegetables in a neighborhood where healthy food was expensive and hard to find. These people weren't asking me for anything. They were building meaningful lives with limited resources, creating value and community and mutual support without expecting anyone to subsidize their dreams. They were living the kind of life that Grandmother Rose had valued, one based on contribution rather than consumption, on building rather than taking, on finding abundance in what you had rather than constantly reaching for what you didn't. My family, for all their education and advantages, had somehow missed these lessons entirely. They'd learned to see money as something to be acquired and spent rather than stewarded and invested. They'd confused lifestyle with success, appearance with achievement, credit with wealth. Saturday morning brought a final text from Claire. So excited for today. Bring whatever financial documents you have, bank statements, savings account info, anything that would help us put together a complete family financial picture. The presumption was staggering. She was asking me to bring documentation of my personal finances to a family meeting, as if my money was somehow a family asset to be discussed and allocated collectively. Texted back, "See you this afternoon." But I wouldn't be bringing bank statements or savings account information. I'd be bringing the knowledge that my family's entire understanding of my life was fundamentally wrong, and the growing conviction that Grandmother Rose had been right, to trust me with something they could never understand. The test wasn't whether I would help them. It was whether I would help them in the right way, in a way that honored both their needs and the values that had earned me this extraordinary gift. As I prepared to leave for the family meeting, I looked around my small apartment one more time. Tomorrow, regardless of how this conversation went, I would still wake up here. I would still make tea in Grandmother Rose's cup, still watch the morning light paint golden rectangles across my floor, still live in the community she'd chosen for me 70 years ago, but the relationships I'd built my whole life around were about to change forever. And for the first time since discovering my inheritance, I felt ready for that change. The professional property appraisal arrived on Friday morning, delivered by courier in a manila envelope marked confidential property owner only. The weight of the document surprised me. 47 pages of detailed analysis, photographs, comparable sales data, and financial projections that represented 3 weeks of thorough evaluation by Manhattan's most respected real estate appraisal firm. I commissioned the report after my conversation with Claire, not because I doubted Robert Henderson's earlier assessment, but because I needed to understand exactly what I was responsible for before my family's meeting tomorrow. The numbers I'd been given felt too enormous to be real. I needed independent verification that I wasn't living in some elaborate fantasy. The executive summary was clear and devastating in its precision. 1247 Riverside Drive represents a prime example of pre-war Manhattan residential architecture in an increasingly desirable neighborhood. Current fair market value, $8.24 million. Annual rental income potential at market rates, $580,000. Property has been maintained to exceptionally high standards and shows strong appreciation potential given ongoing neighborhood development. $8,240,000. The number felt both more real and more surreal than the rounded figure I'd been carrying in my mind. The report included detailed analysis of comparable properties buildings that had sold recently in my neighborhood and similar areas. A building 2 blocks away had sold for $9.1 million 6 months ago. Another, Slightly smaller property had been purchased by developers for $7.8 million and converted into luxury condos selling for $2.5 million each, but the most striking section was the rental analysis. My tenants were paying an average of $2,400 per month for units that could command $4,200 in the current market. I was essentially providing $200,000 annually in below-market housing to 11 households, a subsidy I'd been unconsciously providing while living on my library salary. The appraisers had included photographs of each unit, taken during routine maintenance visits over the past year. Seeing my building through their professional eyes was revelatory. The apartments I'd always thought of as modest were actually charming and well-proportioned, with original hardwood floors, high ceilings, and architectural details that developers spent millions trying to recreate in new construction. My own unit, photographed when I'd been at work, looked small but elegant, like a jewel box rather than a shoebox. The built-in bookshelves that had attracted me were noted as original 1920s craftsmanship, highly desirable period details. My carefully chosen furnishings appeared in the photos as tasteful tenant improvements reflecting appreciation for architectural character. The professional perspective was startling. What my family saw as limitation and compromise, real estate experts valued as authenticity and charm. The financial projections were equally eye-opening. If I raised rents to market rates gradually over the next 3 years, the building's annual income could exceed $500,000. If I sold to developers, the immediate cash proceeds could be invested to generate similar returns with none of the responsibility. But both scenarios assumed I was motivated purely by profit, that maximizing financial return was my primary goal. Reading through the tenant analysis section, I realized why Grandmother Rose had maintained below-market rents. David Chun, the architecture student in 3B, was paying $2,100 for a unit that could rent for $3,800, but he'd been in the building for 4 years, had never missed a payment, and had volunteered his design skills to help plan improvements too. The lobby. Maria Santos, the elementary school teacher in 2A, paid $1,950 for a space worth $3,400 on the open market. But she organized the building's annual holiday party and had helped elderly tenants during the pandemic. These weren't just rental agreements, they were relationships. My grandmother had been subsidizing a community, not just providing housing. The report concluded with development scenarios that made my head spin. Luxury condo conversion could yield individual unit sales totaling $14 million. Complete demolition and new construction could produce a boutique building worth $80 million. Even selling to a rental management company would likely result in immediate displacement of current tenants as rents were adjusted to market levels. Every scenario assumed that maximum profit was the obvious goal, that any other consideration was merely sentimental attachment to inefficient business practices. But sitting in my apartment that evening, surrounded by the evidence of my extraordinary wealth, I felt the clarity that had been building for weeks finally crystallize into certainty. I wasn't just inheriting money, I was inheriting responsibility for a community that Grandmother Rose had spent 70 years building. The below-market rents weren't poor business decisions. They were investments in social stability, in neighborhood character, in the belief that housing should serve people rather than just generating maximum returns for owners. The tenants I saw in the lobby every day weren't just sources of income, they were my neighbors, people whose lives intersected with mine in ways that pure financial relationships never could. David had helped me carry groceries when I was recovering from a sprained ankle. Maria had invited me to her daughter's school play. Mrs. Chun's grandson in 4A had drawn me a picture when I'd helped him find a lost cat. These relationships had value that couldn't be measured in dollars per square foot or captured in market analysis reports. Saturday morning brought an email from Robert Henderson with additional information I'd requested about trust structures and charitable giving options. I'd been thinking about Grandmother Rose's observation that the most valuable things couldn't be measured in dollars, and wondering how to honor that wisdom while managing extraordinary wealth responsibly. You might be interested in these options, Robert had written. Your grandmother established the trust with flexibility for exactly these kinds of decisions. She anticipated that you might want to use the property for community benefit rather than just personal enrichment. The documents he'd attached outlined possibilities I'd never considered. Land trusts that could preserve affordable housing permanently, community development corporations that could expand access to neighborhood benefits, educational foundations that could serve local families, while honoring my grandmother's memory. All of these options would generate less personal income than maximum profit scenarios, but they would create lasting value for the community that had welcomed both my grandmother and me by the time I left for my family's meeting. I had made my decision about more than just whether to lend Claire and Marcus money. I had decided what kind of wealthy person I wanted to be, what kind of legacy I wanted to build with the extraordinary gift I'd been given. The drive to my parents' house felt different this time. I wasn't going as the family member they pitied for her modest circumstances and limited ambitions. I was going as someone who'd been entrusted with significant resources and had chosen to use them in service of values that my family might not understand or appreciate. I was going to set boundaries that would change our relationships forever, but that would honor the woman who believed I was capable of making difficult choices for the right reasons. The manila envelope containing the professional appraisal sat on my passenger seat like evidence of a secret identity. Tomorrow, my family would learn that their assumptions about my life had been completely wrong. But more importantly, they would discover that I'd chosen to prioritize community stability over personal profit, long-term stewardship over short-term, gain meaningful relationships over maximum returns. For the first time in my life, I was going to a family gathering as the person I'd always wanted to be, someone who understood the difference between wealth and worth, between success and significance, between having money and being rich. The family meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock at my parents' house, but by 1:30 I was sitting in my car in their driveway, watching through the living room windows as Claire and Marcus prepared their presentation. They had charts, actual poster boards with graphs and bullet points, arranged on easels like they were pitching to potential investors rather than asking family for financial help. Through the window, I could see Claire pointing to different sections of her display while Marcus nodded and took notes. Sarah sat on the sofa looking uncomfortable, occasionally glancing toward the door, as if she was hoping for an escape route. Mom bustled around offering drinks and snacks, while Dad examined the charts with the serious expression he'd once brought to his business meetings. The staging was impressive and slightly heartbreaking. They'd put enormous effort into packaging, their desperation as opportunity, their need as mutual benefit. Watching them through the glass, I felt a complex mix of love and sadness and growing certainty that what they were about to ask for would not help them in the way they hoped. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Where are you?" "We're ready." To start, I gathered my courage in my purse, which contained the property appraisal and Grandmother Rose's journal, evidence of truths that would shatter every assumption they'd made about this conversation, and walked toward the front door. "Annie!" Mom greeted me with a hug that felt more anxious than usual. Everyone's so excited about today. Claire and Marcus had put together such an interesting presentation. The living room had been transformed into a conference room, complete, with the poster board displays, printed handouts, and an atmosphere of forced optimism that felt like a cross between a business meeting and an intervention. "This is impressive," I said, settling into the armchair that faced their makeshift presentation area. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." Claire beamed with nervous energy. "We wanted to be professional about it. This isn't just family asking for favors. It's a real business proposal that could benefit everyone." Marcus stood beside one of the charts, pointing to a graph that showed projected returns over 5 years. "We've done extensive research on investment opportunities, market analysis, risk assessment, the whole thing." The irony was almost unbearable. Here they were, presenting detailed financial projections to someone whose actual wealth exceeded their wildest estimates, someone who could fund their dreams without even touching her principal assets. But they were also presenting plans based on fundamental misunderstandings about money, success, and sustainable growth, the same misunderstandings that had created their current crisis. "Why don't you walk me through it?" I said, settling back in my chair. Claire took the lead, her presentation polished and rehearsed. Marcus's consulting business needed $50,000 to expand operations, hire additional staff, and secure the kind of contracts that would ensure long-term stability. The projected returns were impressive 15 to 20% annually, with potential for even higher growth as the business established itself in new markets. Her own career advancement required $25,000 for additional certifications, networking, events, and the kind of professional wardrobe that would help her compete for senior positions. The investment would pay off within 2 years through increased salary and bonus potential. The beauty of this arrangement, Claire explained, pointing to a chart showing money flowing between family members, is that it's not really charity. It's family investment where everyone benefits from everyone else's success. Marcus picked up the narrative seamlessly. We've structured it so that Annie gets reliable returns on her investment, much better than savings accounts or CDs, while we get the capital we need to take our careers to the next level. The presentation was professionally crafted and almost convincing. If you didn't know that Marcus's business was failing and Claire's spending problems weren't related to career investment, but to lifestyle inflation she couldn't afford. And what makes you think I have this kind of money available? I asked. The question seemed to surprise them. Claire exchanged a quick glance with Marcus before answering. Well, you live so modestly, she said carefully. No mortgage, no car, payments, no expensive hobbies or travel. Plus, you've been working for 6 years without any major expenses. You must have been able to save at least some money. We're not talking about your life savings, Marcus added quickly. Just a portion of what you've accumulated. Money that could work harder for you than it is sitting in a savings account. They calculated my presumed net worth based on my lifestyle and salary, estimating that I probably had between $40,000 and $80,000 in various accounts. They were asking for almost all of it, confident that I'd be grateful for the opportunity to invest in their futures. Let me make sure I understand, I said slowly. You want me to lend you $75,000, essentially all of my supposed savings to fund business and career plans that you believe will generate returns that would benefit all of us. Exactly, Claire said, relief evident in her voice. You understand perfectly. And you've based this proposal on assumptions about my financial situation that you've never actually verified. A brief pause. Well, we didn't want to pry into your personal finances, Marcus said. But we know you're responsible with money, and we figured you'd be interested in making it work harder for you. What if your assumptions about my finances are wrong? Another pause, longer this time. Wrong how? Claire asked. I reached into my purse and pulled out the property appraisal, setting it on the coffee table between us. What if I don't have $75,000 in savings? Their faces fell almost comically. Oh, Annie, Mom said sympathetically. How much do you have? I'm sure we can adjust the numbers. What if I have considerably more than $75,000? The silence that followed was profound. Dad looked confused. Mom glanced between me and the document on the table. Claire and Marcus stared at me like I'd started speaking in a foreign language. More? Claire said finally, how much more? I opened the appraisal to the executive summary page and turned it so they could see the bolded conclusion. Current fair market value, $8.24 million. What is this? Dad asked, reaching for the document. It's a professional appraisal of the building I live in, I said calmly. The building I own. The building I inherited from Grandmother Rose 6 years ago when I moved into my apartment. The room went completely still. Claire's mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. Marcus had gone pale. Sarah was staring at the document like it might be written in code. That can't be right, Claire said weakly. That says $8 million. $8.24 million to be precise. Plus, I've accumulated approximately $1.3 million in rental income over the past 6 years. Dad was flipping through the appraisal pages, his business background allowing him to process the information faster than the others. This is legitimate, he said quietly. This is from Harrington and Associates. They're one of the most respected firms in the city. Grandmother Rose bought the building in 1954, I continued. She left it to me in trust, to be transferred when I turned 30 or demonstrated mature judgment in residential choices. living in the neighborhood and choosing. My apartment triggered the inheritance. You're a millionaire, Mom said faintly. You've been a millionaire for 6 years. I've been a multimillionaire for 6 years, I corrected gently. And I've been receiving nearly $300,000 annually in rental income that I didn't know existed. Claire was shaking her head slowly. But you live in that tiny apartment. You drive an old car, you shop at thrift stores. Because I like my apartment, because my car works perfectly well. Because I've never cared about impressing people with expensive things. Marcus was staring at his poster boards with a dawning realization that his carefully calculated presentation had been based on completely false premises. You could have helped us months ago. You could have solved all our problems without even thinking about it. I could have, I agreed. But should I have? The question hung in the air like a challenge. What do you mean, should you have? Claire's voice was rising, her careful presentation demeanor cracking under the weight of this revelation. We're family. If you have this kind of money and you've been watching us struggle, I've been watching you make choices, I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying a firmness that surprised even me. The same choices you'd make again if I wrote you checks today. I pulled out Grandmother Rose's journal and opened it to one of the passages I'd marked. She wrote about watching our family dynamics for years, about understanding the difference between helping people and enabling their poor decisions, about recognizing that character matters more than circumstances. Dad was still studying the appraisal. Annie, this property, the appreciation alone, over the past 5 years is more than most people make in a lifetime. Why didn't you tell us? Because of this, I said, gesturing toward the poster boards and charts. Because the moment you found out, it would stop being my inheritance and start being the family's emergency fund. My money would become our money. My decisions would become family discussions, and my life would become about managing everyone else's financial problems. But we're your family, Mom said, her voice small and hurt. Yes, you are, and I love you. But loving someone doesn't mean enabling their mistakes or taking responsibility for choices they make as adults. I stood up and walked to Marcus's business projection chart, pointing to the optimistic revenue forecasts that bore no relationship to his company's actual performance. Marcus, your business is failing. Not because you lack capital, but because you've been promising deliverables you can't produce and taking on contracts you don't have the systems to fulfill. More money would just let you make bigger promises you can't keep. His face flushed red. You don't know anything about my business. I know you're being sued for breach of contract. I know you've been scrambling to pay existing creditors. I know you were hoping my supposed savings would buy you time to figure out solutions to problems that money can't solve. I turned to Claire. And you don't need career investments. You need to learn to live within your means instead of spending money you don't have to maintain an image that's making you miserable. How dare you, she started, but I continued. Grandmother Rose watched our family for decades before deciding who should inherit this building. She chose me not because she felt sorry for me, but because she believed I understood the difference between wealth and worth. The room was completely silent now, the tension thick enough to cut. She left me this inheritance with the trust that I would use it wisely. That includes being wise about how I help the people I love. Sarah spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. So you're not going to help them at all? I'm going to help them the way Grandmother Rose would have by refusing to enable choices that are hurting them, and by modeling what it looks like to build a life based on values instead of appearances. I gathered the appraisal documents and slipped them back into my purse. If you want to know what I'm doing with my inheritance, I'm using it to maintain affordable housing for working families in my neighborhood. I'm subsidizing teachers and students and artists who couldn't otherwise afford to live in Manhattan. I'm preserving a community that values relationships over profit margins. I slung my purse over my shoulder and looked around the room at my family and my parents, shocked and struggling to process this new reality. Claire and Marcus, angry and defensive, and probably already calculating new approaches to access my wealth. Sarah, looking like she wanted to disappear entirely. I'm not the same person you thought I was, I said gently. I'm not the family failure who needs your pity or the convenient solution to your financial problems. I'm someone who's been trusted, with significant resources and the responsibility to use them well. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. When you're ready to have honest conversations about building sustainable lives instead of funding unsustainable ones, I'll be here. But I won't be anyone's ATM, and I won't apologize for making decisions that honor the woman who believed in me enough to give me this chance. The last thing I saw before closing the door was Claire staring at her abandoned poster boards, the carefully crafted presentation that had assumed I was the one person in the family who needed help achieving. Financial stability. Walking to my car, I felt simultaneously liberated and heartbroken. I finally told the truth about my circumstances, but it also probably changed my family relationships forever. As I drove back toward my neighborhood, toward my building, my community, my chosen life, I thought about Grandmother Rose's observation that the most precious gifts often come in small packages. She'd been right in ways she probably never could have imagined. The phone calls started that same evening. First, Mom, her voice careful and wounded. "Sweetheart, I think we need to talk about what happened today. Your father and I are having trouble understanding why you felt you couldn't trust us with something this important." Then Dad, practical and slightly accusatory. "Annie, I've been thinking about the tax implications of what you've inherited. You should have consulted with us. We could have helped you make better financial decisions." But it was Claire's voicemail, left at 11:30 p.m. with the slurred edges that suggested wine had been involved, that revealed the true depth of their shock. "I can't believe you've been sitting on millions of dollars while watching me stress about credit card payments. What kind of person does that to their own sister? Call me back. We need to figure out how to fix this." I didn't call her back that night or the next morning. Instead, I spent Sunday walking through my neighborhood with new eyes, seeing it not just as the community I'd chosen, but as the legacy I'd inherited and the responsibility I'd accepted. Mrs. Chen was arranging produce outside our market when I passed, her movements efficient and practiced after decades of the same routine. She waved and smiled, completely unaware that her landlord's granddaughter now owned the building where her son lived, where her family had put down roots in an expensive city. The small park was full of children whose parents worked the kind of jobs that made Manhattan living a constant financial challenge. Teachers, social workers, graduate students, young professionals just starting their careers. They were the people who made the city function, but were increasingly priced out. Of the neighborhoods they served, my building housed 11 of these households. People who'd been able to afford their apartments because Grandmother Rose had chosen community stability over maximum profit. And because I was now continuing that choice, Monday morning brought Claire to my workplace, something that had never happened in the 6 years I'd worked at the library. She was waiting outside when I arrived, dressed in her business attire, but looking like she hadn't slept well. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "And since you're not answering your phone, I figured I'd come to you." I led her to the staff break room where we could have privacy. She sat across from me at the small table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup from the shop across the street, her usual confidence replaced by something rawer and more desperate. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about enabling poor decisions and building sustainable lives. And I realized you're right about some things." I waited for her to continue. "My spending is out of control. The credit cards, the clothes, the restaurants. I've been living like I make twice what I actually earn because I thought that's what success was supposed to look like." It was the first completely honest thing she'd said to me in years. "But Annie," she continued, her voice breaking slightly, "I'm drowning. The minimum payments on my cards are more than my rent. I'm getting calls from collection agencies. If I don't figure something out soon, I'm going to lose everything." She pulled an envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. "This came on Saturday, the day we had our family meeting. It's an eviction notice. I'm 3 months behind on rent because I've been paying credit cards instead, thinking I could catch up when the Henderson account commission came through. But that deal fell apart, and now ... I opened the notice. Claire had 30 days to pay, $8,700 in back rent plus fees, or she would be legally evicted from the apartment she'd lived in for 4 years. I'm not asking you to solve all my problems, she said, tears starting to flow. I know I need to make changes, real changes. But if you could help me avoid eviction, just this once, I swear I'll get my spending under control. Looking at my sister, really looking at her. Past the designer clothes and perfect makeup to the fear and shame underneath, I felt my heart break a little. She wasn't the entitled, materialistic person I'd been seeing. She was someone who'd gotten caught in the trap of trying to look successful before actually becoming successful, and who was now facing the consequences of choices she didn't know how to undo. How much do you owe in total? I asked quietly. Rent and fees, about $9,000. Credit cards, ... She took a shaky breath. $43,000. $52,000 to completely solve her immediate crisis. Less than 2 months of rental income from my building. And what would you do differently if I helped you? I've already started, she said, pulling out her phone. I downloaded a budgeting app. I made appointments with a financial counselor and a credit counseling service. I even started looking at cheaper apartments, places where the rent wouldn't eat up 60% of my salary. She showed me screenshots of apartments she'd been researching, modest 1-bedrooms in Queens and Brooklyn, places that would require longer commutes but would give her breathing room financially. I know you don't owe me anything, she said. And I know I've been terrible about money. But if you could give me this chance to start over, I promise I won't waste it. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or the strategic vulnerability she'd used in the past. But what I saw was genuine desperation mixed with what looked like authentic determination to change. If I help you, I said slowly, there would be conditions, anything. You move to one of these cheaper apartments within 6 months. You'd stick with the financial counseling for at least a year. You'd be completely transparent about your spending and progress. Yes, absolutely. And you'd accept that this is a one-time intervention, not the beginning of me managing your financial problems. She nodded quickly. I understand. This would be my chance to get it right. I pulled out my checkbook, something I rarely used, but had started carrying since discovering my inheritance, and wrote a check for $9,000. This covers your rent and fees, I said, tearing it off and sliding it across the table. The credit cards are your responsibility to handle through the counseling program and a reasonable payment plan. Claire stared at the check like might disappear. Just like that? Just like that? But Claire, I mean what I said about this. Being one time. I'm helping you now because you're in crisis and you've acknowledged that you need to make real changes. But if you fall back into the same patterns, I won't, she said, her voice fierce. I can't. This has been the worst week of my life, thinking I might lose my home because I was too proud to live within my means. She folded the check carefully and put it in her wallet, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine. Gratitude mixed with something that might have been respect. How did you get so wise about money? She asked. I learned from Grandmother Rose. She understood that security comes from making choices based on your values. Instead of other people's expectations. Claire was quiet for a moment. I think I've been making choices based on what I thought successful people were supposed to want, instead of figuring out what I actually wanted. What do you actually want? I want to stop being afraid every time I check my bank balance. I want to be able to help other people instead of always needing help myself. I want to build something real instead of just looking like I have. It was the most insightful thing I'd ever heard her say about her own life. Those are good goals, I said. And they're achievable if you're willing to do the work. After she left, I sat in the break room thinking about the difference between enabling and helping, between solving someone's problems and giving them the tools to solve their own problems. Claire's eviction notice had been a genuine crisis that required immediate intervention. But the larger patterns that had created the crisis, those were hers to address. That evening, Marcus called. Claire told me what you did for her, he said, and I wanted to apologize for yesterday, for assuming things about your situation, and for thinking you owed us anything. Thank you. She also said you only helped with the emergency, not the underlying debt, that you're making her work through. The financial counseling and moved to a cheaper place. That's right, there was a long pause. I think I need the same kind of help. Not money, well, not just money, but real help figuring out how to fix what I've messed up. What kind of help? Would you be willing to sit down with me and help me understand where my business went wrong? I've been so focused on trying to save it that I haven't stepped back to see the bigger picture. It was exactly the kind of request that Grandmother Rose would have approved of, asking for wisdom and guidance rather than just financial rescue. I'd be happy to help with that, I said. But Marcus, I should tell you that I think your business model has fundamental problems that money alone won't solve. I'm starting to figure that out, he said ruefully. Maybe it's time to start over with something more sustainable. After we hung up, I made tea in Grandmother Rose's cup and sat by my windows, watching the evening light fade over the neighborhood she'd chosen for both of us. For the first time since discovering my inheritance, I felt like I was beginning to understand how to honor her gift, not just by preserving the building or maintaining the community, but by using my resources to help the people I loved build better lives for themselves. The money was just a tool. The real inheritance was the wisdom to use it well. The family dinner 3 weeks later felt like a gathering of different people wearing familiar faces. We were all still in my parents' dining room, still sharing the same table where we'd eaten countless meals together, but the dynamics had shifted in ways that felt both subtle and seismic. Claire arrived early, looking genuinely different. Her outfit was still professional, but noticeably less expensive. A nice blouse from Target instead of designer wear, shoes that looked comfortable rather than impressive. She kept her appointment with the financial counselor and had started the process of finding a more affordable apartment. I put in an application for a place in Astoria. She told us over appetizers. 1 bedroom, but it's bright and clean, and the rent is $1,400 instead of $2,800. I'll have an hour commute, but I'll actually be able to save money every month. Dad looked confused. But why would you want to move further from the city? Your career? My career will be fine, Claire said firmly. And my stress levels will be a lot better when I'm not panicking about money every day. Marcus and Sarah had their own news. After 3 lengthy conversations with me about his business model, Marcus had made the difficult decision to close his consulting firm and take a position with an established company. It turns out I'm really good at the actual consulting work, he explained. I'm just terrible at running a business. So I found a firm that will let me do what I'm good at while someone else handles operations and client management. The salary was lower than what he'd been projecting from his independent business, but it was steady and came with benefits. More importantly, it was real rather than theoretical. We've put the house hunting on hold, Sarah added. We're going to spend a year getting our finances stable and saving for a real down payment instead of stretching ourselves thin. Mom looked around the table with the bewildered expression of someone whose children had all suddenly started speaking a foreign language. But you're all settling, she said. You're giving up on your dreams. We're adjusting our dreams to match reality, Claire corrected gently. There is a difference. It was Dad who asked the question that was obviously on both parents' minds. Is this because of what Annie told us about the inheritance? The table went quiet. This was the first time anyone had directly mentioned my revelation since that afternoon 3 weeks ago, and I could feel everyone's careful attention focusing on how I would respond. It's because finding out about the inheritance made us all take a hard look at our assumptions, I said carefully. About money, about success, about what kind of life is actually worth building. But Annie, Mom said, and I could hear the hurt and confusion in her voice. We still don't understand why you didn't tell us. We're your family. We've always shared important news with each other. It was the conversation I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. I pulled out Grandmother Rose's journal. I'd started carrying it with me, finding comfort in her wisdom during difficult moments. I want to read you something she wrote about our family, I said, opening to a passage I'd marked weeks ago. Today was Claire's law school graduation party. The whole family gathered to celebrate her achievement, but I noticed that the conversation kept returning to money, the cost of law school, her starting salary prospects, whether the investment would pay off. No one asked if she was happy with her choice or what kind of law she wanted to practice. Success for this family seems to be measured entirely in financial terms. I looked up at my parents, who were listening with uncomfortable expressions. She wrote that 7 years ago, and she wrote dozens of similar observations about family, gatherings where money was the primary lens through which we evaluated each other's choices. That's not fair, Dad said. We were just being practical. You were communicating values. I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. And the values you communicated were that worth is measured by wealth, that success means earning more than you need, and that choices should be made based on financial return rather than personal fulfillment. I flipped to another marked passage. Marcus announced his engagement today, and the first questions from the family were about Sarah's job prospects and their combined earning potential. No one asked if they made each other happy or what kind of life they wanted to build together. I worry that this family has forgotten that money is supposed to serve life, not the other way around. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She really wrote that? She wrote pages and pages about watching our family dynamics and worrying about the messages we were sending each other about what mattered. I turned to the entry I'd been saving for this conversation. I've decided to leave the building to Anabelle, but I'm not going to tell the family about her inheritance until after I'm gone. They need to learn to see her value without the distraction of her financial situation. And she needs time to understand her own worth before she has to manage everyone else's expectations about her money. The silence that followed was profound. She knew, Claire said quietly. She knew exactly what would happen if we found out while she was alive. What would have happened? Mom asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. You would have started treating me differently, I said, making assumptions about what I could afford, what I should contribute to family expenses, what kind of lifestyle I should have. The inheritance would have become a family asset instead of my personal responsibility. But we're your family, Dad repeated, echoing Mom's earlier sentiment. Family should help each other. Family should help each other grow, I corrected. Not enable each other's mistakes or take responsibility for each other's choices. I closed the journal and looked around the table at the people I loved, seeing them more clearly than I ever had before. For my entire life, you've all assumed that I was the family failure because I wasn't chasing after expensive things or impressive titles. You paid my small apartment and my modest lifestyle and my quiet contentment because those things didn't match your definition of success. We never said you were a failure, Mom started. You didn't have to say it. It was in every conversation about my lack of ambition, every suggestion that I should want more, every assumption that I was settling for less because I didn't know how to achieve better. Claire was nodding slowly. The pathetic shoebox comment, among others. But the truth is, I wasn't failing at your version of success. I was succeeding at my own version. I was building a life based on meaning rather than money, on relationships rather than recognition, on contentment rather than comparison. I pulled out the most recent letter I'd received from Robert Henderson, updating me on the building's financial performance and some decisions I needed to make about capital improvements. Grandmother Rose left me this inheritance because she believed I understood something about wealth that the rest of you had missed, that its purpose is to serve your values, not replace them. That having money should make you more of who you already are, not turn you into someone different. So, what does that mean for us? Marcus asked. For our family? It means I'm going to keep living according to my values, which include taking care of the people I love, but in ways that help you grow stronger, not ways that make you more dependent. I look directly at my parents. It means I'm not going to bankroll a lifestyle that's built on debt and pretense. It means I'm not going to solve problems that you need to learn to solve yourselves. But if we really need help, Dad began, if you have genuine emergencies, like Claire's eviction notice, I'll help. If you want guidance or support while you make better choices, I'll provide that. But I won't fund choices that undermine your long-term well-being just because I can afford to. The conversation continued for another hour. with questions and clarifications and slowly growing understanding. My parents struggled the most with the idea that having a wealthy daughter didn't automatically translate to an easier retirement. Claire and Marcus, having already begun the work of rebuilding their financial lives, seemed more able to accept the boundaries I was setting. As we prepared to leave, Dad pulled me aside. "I want you to know that your mother and I are proud of you," he said. "Not because of the money, but because of how you're handling it. We raised you to be responsible, and you're being responsible. Even though I'm not using it the way you might, especially because you're not using it the way we might," he said with a rueful smile. "Grandmother Rose was a wise woman. She knew what she was doing when she chose you." Driving home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The sense that my family saw me clearly and valued me for who I actually was rather than who they thought I should become. It had taken $8 million and some very uncomfortable conversations to get there, but for the first time in my adult life, I felt like we were building relationships based on truth rather than assumptions. Grandmother Rose had given me more than money and property. She'd given me the tools to transform my family's understanding of success, wealth, and what it means to live a rich life. 6 months after revealing my inheritance to my family, I was sitting in the conference room at Henderson and Associates, surrounded by architects, contractors, city planning officials, and community representatives, finalizing plans for the most important decision I'd made since discovering I was wealthy. The Rose Dean Community Library was going to occupy the ground floor of my building and the adjacent storefront that had recently become available. It would serve the neighborhood that had welcomed both my grandmother and me, offering literacy programs, computer access, homework help for local children, and meeting space for community organizations. "The design preserves all the original architectural elements," explained Sarah Chen, the architect I'd hired for the project, David Chun's sister, recommended by her brother who lived in 3B. "The pressed tin ceiling, the original hardwood floors, the large windows that will provide natural light for reading areas. The plans spread across the table showed a warm, inviting space that honored the building's 1920s character, while incorporating modern technology and accessibility features. There would be a children's section with low shelves and colorful reading nooks, computer stations for job searches and online classes, study rooms for tutoring sessions, and a small cafe area where neighbors could gather informally. The community input sessions have been incredibly helpful," added Maria Santos, who had volunteered to coordinate neighborhood feedback. Having an elementary school teacher from the building itself involved in the planning had lent credibility to the project and ensured that local voices were centered in every decision. The library would be funded through a community development corporation I'd established, seeded with $2 million from my accumulated rental income. It was structured to be sustainable long-term, with programming costs covered by a combination of the foundation's investments and modest fees for specialized services. "What I love most about this model," said Janet Rodriguez, the librarian I'd recruited to serve as director, "is that it's designed to serve the people who actually live here, not to attract affluent newcomers. The hours accommodate working parents. The programs support families where English isn't the first language, and the services address real needs in the community." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using my inheritance to create exactly the kind of resource that had shaped my own life. Libraries had been my refuge as a child, my inspiration as a student, my career as an adult. Now I had the opportunity to ensure that other children in my neighborhood would have the same access to books, technology, and the quiet spaces where minds and hearts could grow. The funding model was deliberately designed to be replicable. Instead of creating a one-time donation that would eventually run out, I was establishing an endowment that could sustain the library indefinitely, while also serving as a model for other property owners who wanted to contribute to community development. "We've already had inquiries from developers in 3 other neighborhoods," Robert Henderson reported. "They're interested in incorporating community benefit components into their projects, especially now that the city is offering tax incentives for affordable housing preservation and community development." The Rose Dean Community Library was just the beginning of what I was learning to think of as stewardship investing, using wealth to create value that served multiple stakeholders rather than just maximizing returns for property owners. I'd also committed to maintaining below-market rents for current tenants, with gradual increases tied to inflation rather than market rates. New units would be rented at market prices, but with a preference for educators, social workers, and other community service professionals who might otherwise be priced out of Manhattan. The tenant retention rate is remarkable, noted Jennifer, Kim, the property manager I'd hired to oversee day-to-day operations. When people feel secure in their housing, they invest more in their community. We've seen increased participation in building meetings, more neighbor-to-neighbor support, and a real sense of collective ownership of the space. The financial performance was better than I'd expected. Even with below-market rents and the costs of community development, the building was generating enough income to cover all expenses, fund the library endowment, and provide me with a substantial annual income that was more than sufficient for my modest lifestyle. You're proving that community-focused property management can be both socially responsible and financially sustainable, observed Dr. Michael Torres, a professor of urban planning, who is documenting the project as a case study. This model could be transformative if it catches on, but perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the neighborhood itself. Mrs. Chen had told me that her grandson was already asking when the library would be ready because he wanted to have a place to do homework after school. The teenager who practiced violin had offered to give music lessons to younger children. The elderly man who fed pigeons had volunteered to help with gardening. If we created outdoor reading spaces, the building was becoming more than housing, it was becoming a community anchor, exactly as Grandmother Rose had envisioned when she'd made her investment 70 years ago. After the meeting, I walked through the space that would soon be transformed into the library, accompanied by Sarah Chan and Maria Santos. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created exactly the kind of golden atmosphere that I'd always associated with places where learning and discovery happened. Your grandmother would be so proud, Maria said, running her hand along the original molding that would frame the children's reading area. This is exactly the kind of legacy that honors her memory while serving the future. It feels right, I said, which was the simplest way to express the deep satisfaction I felt about this decision. Like, I'm finally understanding what she meant. About finding abundance in unexpected places. That evening, I called my family to update them on the library plans. The conversations were easier now, marked by genuine interest rather than the tension that had characterized our interactions immediately after my revelation. Claire was settling into her new apartment in Astoria and had successfully paid down a significant portion of her credit card debt. She'd started a blog about budget-friendly living that was gaining a following among young professionals trying to build sustainable lifestyles in expensive cities. I never realized how much mental energy I was spending on money anxiety, she told me. Now that I'm living within my means, I have so much more space to think about things that actually matter to me. Marcus had been promoted at his new company and was enjoying the stability of steady employment with clear expectations and reliable income. He and Sarah had started taking weekend trips to look at houses in affordable areas within commuting distance of the city. We're thinking about starting a family, he confided. But we want to be financially stable first, really stable, not just looking stable. My parents had made their own adjustments, downsizing from their large house to a comfortable condo that better matched their retirement income. They'd used the proceeds from the house sale to pay off debt and boost their retirement savings. We're actually happier, Mom admitted. Less space to maintain, lower expenses, and we're in a community with other people our age. I think we were holding on to that big house because we thought we were supposed to, not because we actually wanted to. The transformation in my family's relationship with money and with each other was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of my inheritance. By refusing to enable their financial dysfunction, I inadvertently forced all of us to examine our values and make choices based on what we actually wanted rather than what we thought we were supposed to want. But the real measure of success wasn't in my family's improved financial health or even in the community library that would bear my grandmother's name. It was in the growing understanding that wealth was a tool for creating value, not just accumulating assets. Standing in my apartment that night, making tea in Grandmother Rose's cup while looking out at the neighborhood that had become my responsibility, And my gift, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the woman who'd seen potential in both this place and this person when no one else had. Tomorrow, construction would begin on the Rose Dean Community Library. In 6 months, children from the neighborhood would have a safe place to read and learn and dream. In years to come, other property owners might follow the model we were creating, using their resources to build communities rather than just generate profits. The pathetic little apartment that had once embarrassed my family was becoming the foundation for something much larger than any of us had imagined. Grandmother Rose had been right about abundance coming in unexpected packages. The most precious gifts really were often the smallest. Ones like believing in someone before they learn to believe in themselves. 1 year later, I stood in the main reading room of the Rose Dean Community Library, watching 8-year-old Isabella Martinez sound out words from a picture book, while her 4-year-old brother, Miguel, colored at the table beside her. Their mother, Carmen, was at one of the computer stations working on her nursing school applications, taking advantage of the library's free Wi-Fi and quiet study space. The library had been open for 6 months, and it had already become an integral part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm. Every afternoon, children arrived after school to do homework in the dedicated study area. Evenings brought adult ESL classes and computer literacy workshops. Weekends featured story times, book clubs, and community meetings. "Miss Anabelle!" Isabella called out, having spotted me during her reading break. "I finished the whole book about the girl in the garden. Do you have another one like it?" I walked over to help her select another book from the children's section, marveling at how natural this felt, how perfectly this space served the purpose Grandmother Rose had envisioned all those decades ago. The pressed tin ceiling gleamed in the afternoon light. The original hardwood floors were polished to a warm honey glow, and the large windows provided exactly the kind of natural illumination that made reading feel like a pleasure rather than a chore. "How about this one?" I suggested, pulling out a story about a community garden that transforms a neighborhood. It's about people working together to create something beautiful. Isabella accepted the book eagerly and settled back into her reading nook, a cozy corner with child-sized furniture and colorful cushions where the building's youngest residents could disappear into stories and dreams. The afternoon ritual was interrupted by the arrival of my family, who had driven in from their various homes to attend the library's first anniversary celebration. It had taken months of planning, but tonight we were hosting a community dinner and dedication ceremony for the cornerstone that would make the library's founding permanent. Annie. Claire called out, looking remarkably different from the stressed, overspending person she'd been a year ago. Her outfit was simple but elegant clothes that reflected thoughtful choices rather than desperate attempts to impress. "This place is even more beautiful than the photos you sent." She was followed by Marcus and Sarah, who were visibly pregnant and glowing with the confidence of people who'd planned carefully for the changes coming to their lives. Marcus had been promoted again at his consulting firm, and Sarah had started a successful freelance business that allowed her to work from home while preparing for motherhood. "The acoustics are amazing," Marcus observed, noting how the high ceilings and original architecture created a sense of spaciousness without making normal conversation feel disruptive. "You can hear the children reading, but it's not chaotic." My parents arrived a few minutes later, looking relaxed and content in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. Retirement was suiting them. They'd found volunteer opportunities that used Dad's business skills and Mom's organizational talents, and they discovered that having enough was often better than having more. "Your grandmother would be over the moon," Dad said, examining the framed photograph of Rose Dean that hung near the main entrance. It was a picture from the 1950s, showing her in front of the building shortly after she'd purchased it, her expression combining determination and hope in equal measure as the afternoon progressed. Neighbors began arriving for the anniversary celebration. Mrs. Chun brought homemade dumplings, following a tradition she'd established of contributing food to every library event. David Chun, now in his final year of architecture school, had created a beautiful scale model of the building that would be permanently displayed to show visitors how the library fit into the larger community context. Maria Santos arrived with her daughter Elena, who at 6 years old was already one of the library's most dedicated patrons. Tommy, the doorman from across the street, came with his sister Maria and her family. continuing the building's tradition of interconnected relationships that spanned multiple households. "Before we begin the ceremony," announced Janet Rodriguez, the library director, "I want to share some statistics about our first 6 months of operation." The numbers were remarkable. Over 2,000 people had visited the library, checking out more than 5,000 books and using computer stations for everything from job applications to citizenship test preparation. The after-school homework program served an average of 25 children daily. The adult education classes had helped 18 people improve their English skills and 12 people complete their GED requirements. But the real measure of success, Janet continued, isn't in numbers. It's in the fact that this space has become what every community library should be: a place where neighbors become friends, where children discover the joy of reading, where families can access resources that help them build better lives. The dedication ceremony began at sunset, with the entire community gathered around the cornerstone that would be placed at the library's entrance. The stone was made of granite quarried in Vermont, with simple but elegant engraving. Rose Dean, Community Library, founded 2025, dedicated to the belief that every community deserves access to knowledge, beauty, and hope. "My great-grandmother Rose Dean bought this building 71 years ago," I said, addressing the crowd of neighbors, family members, and friends who had gathered. She saw potential in a neighborhood that others overlooked, just as she saw potential in a granddaughter that others underestimated. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, children who would grow up with this library as part of their daily lives, parents who were building futures in a community that supported their dreams, neighbors who had become family through shared investment in each other's well-being. She taught me that the most valuable investments aren't always the ones that generate the highest financial returns. Sometimes the most valuable investments are the ones that generate hope, community, and the kind of abundance that can't be measured in dollars. Claire stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. "A year ago, I thought abundance meant having enough money to buy whatever I wanted. Now, I understand that abundance means having enough security to focus on what really matters." Marcus nodded. We spent years chasing after a lifestyle that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. This library represents something different: success that serves others, wealth that creates value for an entire community. As the ceremony concluded and neighbors began sharing food and stories in the library's main room, I found myself standing near the children's section, watching Isabella Martinez read her new book to her little brother while their mother finished her computer work nearby. This was what Grandmother Rose had meant about finding magic in ordinary places. Not the flashy magic of sudden wealth or dramatic transformation, but the quiet magic of small acts of generosity multiplied across time and community. The pathetic little apartment that had once embarrassed my family had become the foundation for something extraordinary, not because of its monetary value, but because it had taught me to find abundance in simplicity, meaning in modesty, and wealth in relationships that enriched everyone involved. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the last neighbors had headed home, I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my apartment just as I had thousands of times before. But now, instead of escaping to my private sanctuary, I was returning home to the heart of a community I'd helped create. I made tea in Grandmother Rose's cup and sat by my window, looking down at the library where a few lights were still glowing, where tomorrow more children would discover new stories and more families would find the resources they needed to build better lives. The inheritance I'd received was measured in millions of dollars, but its true value lay in the understanding that wealth was worthless unless it served something larger than personal comfort. Grandmother Rose had left me money, but more importantly, she'd left me an example of how to use resources wisely, how to see potential in unexpected places, and how to build abundance that could be shared rather than hoarded. My family no longer pitied my small apartment or modest lifestyle. They'd learned, as I had, that true success wasn't about impressing others with what you could afford, but about creating value that would outlast your own lifetime. The Rose Dean Community Library would serve this neighborhood for generations. Children who were not yet born would learn to read in these rooms, would discover dreams between these shelves, would understand that their community believed in their potential enough to invest in their futures. That was the real inheritance, not the money itself, but the wisdom to use it in service of hope, community, and the radical belief that everyone deserves access to beauty knowledge, and the chance to become who they're meant to be. Outside my window, the city hummed with 8 million stories of struggle and triumph, dreams and disappointments, ordinary people building extraordinary lives, one choice at a time. I was part of that story now, not as someone who'd been rescued by unexpected wealth, but as someone who'd learned to use good fortune to lift others up. Grandmother Rose's voice echoed in my memory. The most precious gifts often come in small packages, my dear. She'd been right in ways that took me years to understand. The small package of a tiny apartment had contained the seeds of community transformation. The small package of a quiet life had held the potential for extraordinary impact. The small package of being underestimated had given me the freedom to define success on my own terms as I prepared for bed in my 400 square feet of perfectly sufficient space. I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you're meant to do, with exactly the resources you need to make a difference. My pathetic little hovel had become the foundation of something beautiful, just as Grandmother Rose had always known it would.